Welcome. You've arrived at a quiet shore, perhaps by accident, perhaps by longing. Either way, you are here now, and that is enough. This is the empty boat, a place between worlds, where stories drift in like mist over a still lake, and the weight you carry can be set down for just a little while. Each tale you're about to hear was born from silence and written in the language of loss, forgiveness, and awakening. Some will take you through forgotten villages under a pale moon. Some will walk beside broken hearts on city rooftops. But all of them speak to the same thing you may be quietly searching for. So breathe. Let the world outside fall away like autumn leaves on water. Let your heart unfold like a lantern left gently on the river, and let these stories find you, not as lessons, but as mirrors. This is not a journey to learn something. It's a remembering of who you've always been beneath the noise. The first story begins now.
Story 1. The sound of her steps on the wooden floor. The old farmhouse stood at the edge of a forgotten valley in southern France. Weather-worn and half-swallowed by ivy, it leaned ever so slightly, as if bowing to time. Inside, the scent of dried lavender clung to the wood like memory, and the floorboards creaked with the weight of stories no one had told in years. Louise lived there alone now. She had once lived with her husband, Paul, and their daughter, Eloise. That was before the silence came, before the laughter stopped echoing through the halls, before the night she could never speak of without her voice trembling. She was 73 when she heard it for the first time again, the unmistakable sound of her daughter's footsteps on the wooden floor upstairs. She was stirring honey into her evening tea when it happened. Tap, tap, tap. Louise froze. Her fingers gripped the handle of the spoon too tightly, and it clattered to the table. She waited. Her old ears weren't what they used to be, but she wasn't imagining things. Tap, tap. Upstairs, right above her, in Eloise's old room. She didn't go up that night. She sat in her kitchen chair until her tea went cold, then took the candle and went to bed, saying nothing to the dark. But the next night, she heard it again, and the night after that. She told herself it was the wind, or mice, or her mind playing tricks on her. But deep down, something in her chest bloomed, something dangerous, hope. Because Eloise had been gone for nearly 30 years, and the floorboards had been silent ever since. When Louise was young, she had dreamed of living near the sea. She used to paint small seascapes on wooden boards and sell them in the village market. Paul had been a carpenter, patient and careful with his hands, and always quiet when he worked. He built Eloise a tiny boat when she was 9, a sailboat that caught the breeze in the orchard and flew like a dragonfly across puddles after rain. But Louise had not spoken to Paul in the last 2 years of his life. After Eloise disappeared, something inside them both broke, but not in the same place. He turned inward, she turned cold. When he died of a quiet illness, she didn't cry. She only shut the door to their daughter's room, locked it, and never opened it again. Now, at night, the sound came, a slow, deliberate pacing above her head. Not frantic, not threatening, just steady, like a memory learning how to walk. On the 5th night, Louise lit a candle and climbed the stairs. She hadn't been up there since 1994. The wallpaper was still the same, faded roses blooming across pale blue. The door to Eloise's room was shut. She hesitated, her hand on the knob. She could feel the beat of her heart in her fingertips. She opened the door. Nothing had moved. Not a single book out of place, not a thread of dust disturbed. The rocking chair by the window sat still. The porcelain music box on the shelf, with its broken dancer inside, remained untouched. The air smelled of cedar and thyme. Louise stepped inside. Her feet made no sound. She waited. Nothing. No footsteps, no whisper, no trace of what she had heard. But as she turned to leave, something caught her eye. A small shoe print on the wooden floor, child-sized, as if pressed into the grain with the lightest touch. She knelt down, reaching for it, but when her fingers brushed the wood, it vanished, just like that, as if it had never been there. The next morning, Louise took down the box. It was a wooden chest hidden behind the linen cupboard, sealed with rusted latches and wrapped in a moth-eaten shawl. Inside were pieces of a life: a drawing Eloise had made of their family at the beach, a cracked seashell from their last trip to Nice, a folded letter Louise had never sent. She unfolded the letter now. It was stained at the corners and faded, but still legible. Eloise, I'm sorry. I never should have shouted that night. I never should have said those words. Wherever you are, please forgive me. Please come home. She hadn't remembered writing it. She must have, in those blurry weeks after the disappearance, when the world had become a fog of questions and guilt. Louise sat in the chair by the window, the letter trembling in her lap. I didn't mean it, she whispered aloud. The candle flickered on its own. In a nearby village, there was a Zen hermit named Auguste. He had once been a French literature professor, but after losing his wife and son in a car accident, he gave away everything and wandered for 20 years. People said he lived near the lake in an abandoned monastery and spoke little, but sometimes, when grief had nowhere else to go, people sought him out. Louise walked there with the letter in her coat. She didn't expect him to answer the door, but he did. His beard was long and silver, and his eyes looked like they had once belonged to someone else. She handed him the letter. I think my daughter is still walking in that house, she said, but not because she's alive. Auguste read the letter slowly. Then he looked at her for a long time. Sometimes, he said, what lingers is not the soul of the departed, but the pain we never dared to forgive. Louise's eyes welled. I blamed her for something she never did, she said. I thought she ran away. I told her that night she'd ruined everything. But she just went outside. She never came back. Auguste nodded. There is a Zen story, he said, of a man who shot an arrow into the dark and never found the body. Every night he dreamed of blood on his hands, but he never knew if he had truly killed. He aged. The dreams continued. One day, in deep meditation, he realized the arrow had never struck anyone, but it had pierced his own soul. Louise clutched her hands. I want to forgive myself, she said, but I don't know how. Auguste gently placed a bowl of water before her. The surface trembled with the breeze. Drop the letter into the bowl, he said. She did. The paper darkened, curled, and then slowly sank. Now, he said, say what you could not say to the daughter in your heart, not for her to hear, but for the part of you that never stopped waiting. Louise closed her eyes. I love you, Eloise, she said. I'm sorry I ever made you feel unloved. You didn't ruin anything. I did. But I'm still your mother, and I will keep lighting the window in case you're still looking for a way home. That night, the sound returned. But this time, it moved differently, like a dance, a skip, a soft turn. And then, it faded into stillness. Louise stood at the foot of the stairs, candle in hand, tears on her cheek, and she whispered, Good night. In the following weeks, she opened the windows in Eloise's room. She gave away the locked box. She planted lavender near the old orchard. Sometimes she still heard the faint sound of steps, but it no longer frightened her. She understood now. The sound had always been there, not outside her, but within. It was not her daughter's ghost. It was her own grief, finally finding a way to walk free. Philosophical reflection. The sound we hear is not always of footsteps past. It may be the echo of our own regret pacing within the soul. In Buddhism, we speak not of haunting, but of attachment. And the greatest ghost is often our inability to forgive ourselves. In Zen, there is no separation between the listener and the sound. When we hear footsteps in the night, the first question is not who walks, but rather what in me has not yet rested. Psychological commentary. Louise's experience mirrors what modern psychology calls complicated grief, a long-lasting form of mourning where closure is blocked by guilt or unresolved emotions. The phantom footsteps may be read as auditory manifestations of trauma or even dissociative memory. But deeper still, they represent how unresolved emotions can shape perception, even decades later. The act of ritual, visiting the hermit, burning the letter, naming the sorrow, is both a symbolic and therapeutic bridge toward healing. In narrative therapy, when unspoken truths are finally voiced, they lose their power to haunt. Closing meditation. Tonight, as you sit in the quiet, ask yourself, what footsteps do I still hear? Are they mine or someone I have not yet forgiven? Breathe gently. Inhale the silence, exhale the story. And if a floorboard creaks in your memory, let it. That too is part of the path home. Let go. You are still walking, and that means you are still free. Story 2. Beneath the olive tree where he waited. The olive trees stood at the edge of the vineyard, older than anyone in the village, its limbs twisting like the thoughts of a restless mind. No one picked olives from it anymore. It bore fruit, but the taste was strange, too bitter, as if soaked in secrets. Under this tree, every afternoon at exactly 4 o'clock, Mateo would sit. People in the village of Calencia, a sunburned stretch of Spanish countryside near Andalusia, said he had been coming there for 30 years. They said he waited for his younger brother, Emiliano. But Emiliano had never come back. He had left one morning with their father's will in his coat pocket after a night of shouting. That was the last anyone had seen of him. No letters, no phone calls, no body. Just absence. Just silence. Mateo never moved away. He never married. He never sold the vineyard or harvested the olives from that tree. He just waited. Children grew up thinking of him as part of the landscape, a scarecrow with a pulse. Tourists passed by and whispered, as if loud voices might disturb the ghost of his hope. But Mateo never looked up. He only watched the path. As if somewhere in the distant heat, the silhouette of his brother might reappear, carrying the apology that never came. The day Emiliano left had been clear and sharp, the kind of day where truth feels thinner, easier to cut through. Their father had died 2 months earlier. His estate, mostly the vineyard, some land, a small cottage by the sea, was to be divided between the 2 sons. But Mateo wanted to keep the land in the family, just as their father had asked with his final breath. Emiliano wanted to sell. "I need to live my own life," Emiliano had shouted. "You want to grow old with grapes and dust. I want more than that." "You mean money," Mateo had replied, his voice brittle with hurt. That night, the argument grew like fire between them. Words turned into accusations. And then, Emiliano, younger by 7 years and twice as impulsive, did something no one expected. He took the will, walked out into the dark, and never returned. At first, Mateo had searched. He rode a train to Madrid, checked hostels, asked mutual friends, followed leads that always went nowhere. Once, he saw someone who looked like Emiliano at a train station in Seville, but when he ran after him, the man turned, and the eyes were all wrong. Eventually, Mateo returned to Calencia. The vineyard was overrun. The olives had fallen, rotting beneath the tree. But the house was still there. The olive tree still stood.
And so he waited. He waited for justice, for regret, for Emiliano. One autumn evening, a stranger arrived at the vineyard gate. She was young, maybe 21, with a worn satchel and eyes too tired for her age. Her name was Laura. She asked if this was the house of Mateo Alvarez. She said she had something to give him. Inside her bag was a letter. The paper was crumpled, the ink faded, but the signature at the bottom had not changed. Emiliano. It was dated 2 weeks before he died.
Mateo's hands trembled as he opened it. Mateo, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I've written 100 versions before and torn them up, but this one I'll try to send. I was in Brazil, then Argentina. I kept running, thinking I could escape the shame of what I did. I forged the will. I sold the land by the sea. I lived off it. Then I lost it. Then I tried again. Nothing worked. I've been ill, something in my blood. The doctors say I don't have long. There's a tree behind the vineyard, the one we used to climb when we were boys. Do you remember? Sometimes I imagine you still sitting under it, and in those dreams you're not angry. You're just waiting. If you're there, if you ever were, I'm sorry. Your brother, Emiliano. Mateo did not cry. He folded the letter. He poured Laura a cup of warm wine. She told him that Emiliano had died in a hospice near Córdoba. No family, no funeral, just a photograph of the vineyard by his bedside. I think he always wanted to come back, she said. He just didn't know how. Mateo nodded. He didn't trust words anymore. He trusted silence. He trusted trees. That night, he went to the olive tree. It was quiet, and the moonlight traced silver lines through the leaves. He sat on the familiar rock beneath the gnarled trunk and closed his eyes. I forgive you, he whispered into the night. Then he waited. But something had shifted. In the days that followed, the tree began to drop its olives again, plump and dark, without the bitter taste. The vines on the land flourished. People said the wine that year was sweeter than ever before. One morning, the postman brought a letter without a return address. Inside was a photograph. 2 boys standing under an olive tree, grinning with dirt on their cheeks. On the back, scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting, "Even a tree remembers the ones who climbed it." Philosophical reflection. In the Zen tradition, there is a parable of 2 monks crossing a river. One carries a woman on his back to help her across. Later, the younger monk says, "We monks are not supposed to touch women. Why did you carry her?" The elder monk replies, "I set her down at the river's edge. Why are you still carrying her?" Mateo carried Emiliano not in his hands, but in his heart, for 30 years. Not because he chose to, but because he didn't know how to put him down. Forgiveness is not a moment, it is a practice. And sometimes the practice begins the moment we realize we're the ones holding the weight. In waiting under the olive tree, Mateo wasn't waiting for his brother. He was waiting for himself to return. Psychological reflection. Mateo's story reflects the psychological pattern known as prolonged grief disorder, where the absence of closure perpetuates a cycle of emotional paralysis. The olive tree becomes a symbolic container of unresolved conflict, its fruit turning bitter, like the emotions festering unspoken. When we suffer betrayal, especially from loved ones, our sense of identity becomes tangled with the story of the hurt. The act of waiting becomes both a punishment and a placeholder for the healing we resist. Modern therapy encourages reauthoring one's narrative, shifting from "I was betrayed and never recovered" to "I was wounded and I'm learning to release." In the story, the act of reading Emiliano's letter, hearing his regret, and naming forgiveness aloud begins Mateo's return to wholeness, not because the past was erased, but because it was finally met. Closing meditation. Tonight, Ask yourself, whom have I been waiting for beneath my own olive tree? Whose return would release me from anger, regret, or longing? You may never receive their letter, but you can write your own. Close your eyes. Picture them, not as they were, but as they exist now in your heart's memory. Say what has never been said, and then set it down. The tree remembers, but the waiting is yours to release. Let the fruit sweeten again. Let yourself come home. Story 3. The Suitcase at St. Mary's Abbey. The abbey stood on the wind-carved cliffs of Northern Ireland, its stone walls covered in moss like the green memory of time. From the sea, it looked like a solemn shadow, silent, enduring. Locals said it hadn't held a full congregation in over 60 years. Still, every year, a few monks remained, keeping vigil over the tide, the garden, and whatever remained of faith. One April morning, before sunrise, Brother Thomas found the suitcase. It was sitting by the arched gate of St. Mary's Abbey, perfectly still. No footprints in the grass, no name, no note. Just an old brown leather suitcase, worn at the corners and fastened shut with rusting clasps. He looked around. The wind was brisk but not stormy. The road from the village curved quietly into fog. Whoever had left it was gone. He bent down, ran a hand across the cracked handle, and lifted it. It was heavy. Inside, something shifted. He brought it in without a word. At breakfast, the monks said little. The rule of silence was lifted only in emergencies or prayer. Still, a few raised brows and glances made their way across the wooden table. Brother Thomas placed the suitcase in the library under the old stained glass window. Dust motes drifted through the air like slow snow. The light passing through the colored glass fell directly onto the case, painting it with reds and blues like a confession. He waited. He wasn't sure for what. 3 days passed. No one came for it. On the 4th day, with permission from the abbot, he opened it. Inside were only a few items: a wool coat, a silver necklace with a broken clasp, a diary, thick, its pages swollen with time, and at the very bottom, wrapped in linen, a photograph. 2 young men standing shoulder to shoulder in front of the abbey gates, smiling. One of them was Brother Thomas. His hands began to tremble. His name hadn't always been Thomas. Once, long ago, he had been called Gabriel. He had arrived at the abbey as a young man in the late 1980s, fleeing a life that had grown too sharp, too loud, too tangled. He never told the brothers much, only that he was from London and that he had nothing left. But that wasn't true. He had left someone behind. His name was Michael. They met in university, both studying philosophy, both restless, both carrying invisible wounds from childhood. They had shared books, thoughts, long walks in the rain, and a small flat filled with secondhand furniture and unspoken tenderness. In those days, being 2 men in love was not something you could name without consequence. So they didn't name it. They just lived it, quietly, carefully, fervently. Until one day, Gabriel's father found a letter. The confrontation that followed was violent and final. He was disowned, thrown out, and left without family or shelter. Michael offered to run away with him. "Let's leave this place," he said. "We can go anywhere. I don't care where we live as long as I can be with you." But Gabriel had already made a decision, one born from shame, fear, and a deep ache to disappear. He left. He never told Michael where he went. He didn't even say goodbye. The monastery took him in. He became Brother Thomas. He scrubbed the floors, planted the gardens, and prayed. Every day, he tried to replace memory with ritual, love with silence. But memory does not bow to robes or rituals. And now it had returned, quietly, respectfully, in a suitcase. He opened the diary. The first page was dated May 12, 1989.
Gabriel, if you're reading this, it means I've found you, or at least that I've left a part of me where you once were. Each entry was addressed to him. Michael had written year after year, always imagining Gabriel might one day return to the world and stumble across his words. I don't hate you. I never did. I only wanted you to be free. I'm sorry the world made you feel like you had to vanish. I kept the photograph from our day in Ireland. Remember the Abbey? We laughed about how peaceful it was. You said, maybe this is where souls go to sleep. I didn't understand it then. I think I do now. As Brother Thomas read, a knot inside him began to unravel. The entries were raw, unpolished. They spoke of other relationships, failed and fleeting, of Michael's work as a teacher, of a small apartment by the sea, of a dog named Rue, of sickness, of loneliness, of forgiveness. And then, near the end, I've always wondered if you became a monk. I imagined you in robes, walking gardens in the fog, hands behind your back, lips moving with prayers I'll never hear. I've been diagnosed with something final. I don't have much time. So I'm sending the suitcase. I don't know if you'll ever see it, but I need to return these things to you. Not because they belong to you, but because I no longer need to carry them. And I think maybe, just maybe, neither do you. Brother Thomas closed the diary. He placed both hands flat on the table, trembling. Then he wept. Not the sharp, loud weeping of sudden grief, but the quiet, surrendered kind that comes when the truth has no more disguises to wear. The next morning, he asked for solitude in the chapel. He sat there from sunrise until nightfall. He did not pray. He did not speak. He simply listened to the walls, to the waves, to the voice that had been buried beneath years of chance and silence. That night, he took the photograph and placed it on the windowsill in his room. He left the suitcase open, and for the first time in over 3 decades, he signed a letter with his true name. Philosophical reflection. In Zen, there is a saying, "The path is not to be walked by leaving footprints, but by letting the dust settle in the heart." Gabriel's transformation into Brother Thomas was not a mistake. It was a movement, a refuge. But refuge becomes prison when it denies the soul's whole truth. The suitcase is a symbol not of return, but of offering. In Michael's act of surrender, we witness a subtle teaching. To carry something for a lifetime is not love. To release it, without knowing if it will ever be received, that is. St. Mary's Abbey became the vessel through which memory found stillness, not by demanding reconciliation, but by allowing the silence to speak. Psychological reflection. The story mirrors a central truth in trauma psychology. The act of emotional suppression does not erase pain, it fossilizes it. Gabriel's shame, unprocessed, led to the adoption of a new identity and the erasure of a self still grieving love, family, and safety. The suitcase functions as a transitional object, a tool used in therapeutic contexts to bridge trauma and healing. In symbolic terms, it returns the exiled parts of the self to the conscious mind. Through Michael's diary, Gabriel is allowed to witness his own life from a compassionate lens. The narrative also touches on themes of complicated grief, internalized homophobia, and the deep human need for recognition. But ultimately, it presents healing not as a grand gesture, but as the quiet integration of parts once separated by fear. Closing meditation. And you, what have you left sealed, hidden behind old doors of silence? What suitcase waits at the gate of your heart, asking to be opened? Perhaps the letter was never sent. The goodbye was never spoken. But the weight, it's still there. Close your eyes. Picture the person, the truth, the moment you left behind. Now, gently open the case. Hold what's inside. Then, breathe and begin the sacred art of returning it to light.
You don't need to run. You only need to remember. Not all love ends. Some of it waits in silence. Like a suitcase beneath stained glass. Story 4. The Widow's Candle in Oaxaca. In a narrow alleyway of Oaxaca's old quarter, where the adobe walls glowed amber in the setting sun, there stood a humble house with blue shutters and a sagging red tile roof. Every evening, as dusk embraced the hills, a single candle burned on the windowsill, soft and still, like a whisper left behind. The neighbors knew the woman who lived there as Doña Teresa, always in black, always polite, always alone. They said she had lost her husband in an accident many years ago. Some whispered it was a murder. Others claimed he simply vanished. But none dared ask. In Oaxaca, grief was sacred, and silence was its guardian. For 27 years, Doña Teresa lit the candle without fail. Rain or wind, sickness or festival, it didn't matter. At precisely 7:30 each night, she would place the candle on the windowsill, light the match with reverence, and bow her head. No one knew why. No one had ever seen her cry. The house had once been filled with color and laughter. Teresa had been a schoolteacher. Her husband, Manuel, was a stonemason with calloused hands and a soul full of music. He played the guitar under the fig tree in their courtyard, sang old love songs in a raspy voice, and brought her mangoes wrapped in newspaper after every payday. Their love had not been perfect, but it had been real. Then, one September afternoon, he went to a nearby town for a job. There had been a landslide, or at least that's what the authorities said. No witnesses, no body. Just a collapsed hillside and a silence that arrived like a second skin. Teresa waited for days, then weeks. When no coffin came, she did something no one expected. She bought 27 candles, one for each year of their marriage, and she began to light them, one by one, every evening. Years passed, the city changed, markets expanded, graffiti grew bold. But Teresa remained unchanged, like a figure stitched into time. Children who once whispered ghost stories about her grew up and moved away, but the candle remained. Some nights, when the wind was soft, people said they could hear her speaking, to no one, murmuring as if in conversation, not a prayer, not a monologue, a dialogue. One evening, during the Day of the Dead preparations, a young journalist named Camila came to the alley. She was writing a piece on mourning rituals. Her editor said, "Find something human, something strange, something beautiful." She'd heard about Teresa's candle from a florist near the cemetery. "She's like a poem," the florist said, "but one you can't quite read." Camila knocked on the door just before sunset. Teresa opened it without surprise, as if she'd been expecting her. "You've come for the candle," she said softly. Camila hesitated. I came to ask why you light it." Teresa looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once and stepped aside. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon and old paper. The walls were lined with dusty books, dried herbs, and a few photographs, all black and white. No pictures of Manuel. Camila sat at the kitchen table as Teresa boiled water for café de olla. When the tea was poured and the candle lit, Teresa finally spoke. "I don't light the candle for grief," she said. "I light it so that Manuel doesn't forget the way back." Camila tilted her head. "Back to here?" Teresa looked out the window. "Back to this life, this love, this breath. Wherever he is, I believe he still walks. Maybe not in a body, but in memory, in longing, in light." Camila scribbled in her notebook, then paused. "Do you believe he's dead?" Teresa smiled faintly. "We all are, in pieces, but some parts linger." She tapped her chest gently, "and some wait." That night, as Camila walked back through the cobbled streets, She didn't write a single word. Not yet. She felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not quite sadness, not quite awe. Something closer to stillness. The next day she returned, and the next. Each night, Teresa let her sit as the candle was lit. She began to tell stories, not about Manuel's death, but his life. How he laughed with his whole body. How he danced clumsily but with joy. How he once cried when a bird died on their balcony. She also spoke of doubt. "There were nights," she whispered, "when I thought of blowing the candle out forever. I screamed at the wind. I begged God to let me forget. But," she touched the matchbox gently, "then I'd see his boots by the door, the ones I never moved. And I'd think, what if tonight he remembers the way home?" Camila finally asked, "And if he doesn't? If he never does?" Teresa met her eyes. "Then at least he'll see there was light." One evening, Teresa didn't come to the door. The candle was unlit. Camila knocked again. No answer. She asked the neighbor, who said Teresa had gone to the hospital that morning, something with her lungs. She had been coughing for weeks, but said nothing. Camila rushed to the hospital. Teresa was in a small, pale room, a single IV in her arm. Her eyes fluttered open when she heard Camila's voice. "I forgot the candle," she whispered. Camila held her hand. "I'll light it." That night, for the first time, someone else lit the flame in the little blue-windowed house. And, for the first time, Teresa slept through the hour without fear. 3 days later, Teresa passed away. Quietly, without pain, a nurse said she was smiling. The village held a small funeral. Camila, at her own expense, printed a photo of Teresa and placed it beside a marigold altar. On the frame, she carved one word, Esperando, waiting. She kept the house open for a week, allowing neighbors and strangers to pass through. On the final night, she sat by the window with the candle in her hand. She lit it, watched the flame flicker. Then she whispered, "Manuel," she waited. A year later, Camila published her book, Candles That Do Not Burn Out. The opening chapter was about Teresa. Readers across the world wrote letters saying they too had someone they lit candles for, in memory, in anger, in love. Camila returned to Oaxaca often. She kept the house as it was. Every year, on September 3rd, the day Manuel vanished, she lights the candle. Not for him, for her. Philosophical reflection. In Zen, we speak not of time as a line, but as a breath, cyclical, returning, never gone. Teresa's candle is not a plea for resurrection, but a gesture of remembrance, a recognition that love, when it is true, does not demand presence. It offers light. The act of lighting the candle becomes a practice of compassion. In Buddhism, such an act may be seen as paramita, a perfection, not because it changes the past, but because it transforms the present. To wait, not with clinging, but with peace, that is the flame that does not burn out. Psychological reflection. Teresa's ritual reflects the therapeutic concept of continuing bonds, the idea that the dead are not entirely gone, but integrated into our lives in evolving ways. Rather than severing ties with the deceased, we reshape our connection, honoring memory and emotion. Her nightly candle was not pathology, it was resilience. It gave her structure, meaning, and a sense of agency in the face of ambiguous loss. Camila's experience illustrates vicarious healing, how witnessing another's grief, when fully expressed, can soften our own. Teresa became a mirror not only for Camila, but for all who feared their memories might one day be forgotten. Closing meditation. Perhaps you too have someone who never truly returned. A name unspoken. A goodbye unfinished. A presence that lingers at the edge of sleep. Tonight, find a quiet place. Light a candle. Not to hold on, but to illuminate the doorway. Speak softly, not to summon, but to honor. Let the flame flicker. Let it dance. And if no one returns, know that your light was enough, always. Story 5. The Child Who Couldn't Forgive Her Mother. The town of Albi sat nestled in southern France like a forgotten verse of a lullaby. Terracotta rooftops warmed gently beneath the sun, and narrow cobbled streets curved like old secrets through the hills. At the edge of the town stood an orphanage, weathered, silent, and stubbornly alive. They called it Maison du Ciel, House of the Sky. Clara had grown up there. She never asked why her mother left her there. She never cried when the other children were visited by relatives bearing soft cookies and clumsy apologies. She watched the gates with quiet hatred and kept a notebook hidden under her mattress where she wrote the same sentence over and over. She left me. As the years passed, Clara became the kind of child adults called strong when they meant hardened. She studied well. She refused comfort. She spoke only when necessary. She didn't believe in God, or forgiveness, or fairy tales, only in facts. And the fact was, her mother had abandoned her when she was 5 years old, without a note, without a face to hate, only a name that the records barely preserved: Isabelle Dumas. By the time Clara turned 28, she had moved to Paris. She worked as an archivist at the National Library, cataloging documents that had outlived the people who wrote them. She preferred paper to people, silence to sentiment. But one rainy morning, a letter arrived. There was no return address. Only 2 words on the envelope. For Clara. The handwriting was old, shaky. Inside was a single page. Clara, I don't know if you'll read this. I don't deserve that much. But I want to tell you what I've never told anyone. I was 19 when I had you. I was afraid. Your father left before you were born. I had no job, no family. I thought leaving you at the orphanage would give you a better life. I stayed nearby for years, watching you through the fence. You looked strong. You didn't need me. But I needed you. I've lived in Marseille for a long time. I'm sick now. The doctors say it won't be long. If you come, I will understand your silence. If you don't, I will still love you. Always, Isabelle. Clara didn't move for a long time. She read it again, then again. She didn't cry. She packed the letter in her bag and went to work. 3 weeks passed. Then, one afternoon, Clara stepped onto the train bound for Marseille. It was not forgiveness that moved her. It was curiosity, anger, a need to see the face that had haunted every silence in her life. The hospice was small, tucked between a church and a bakery. The nurse at the front desk recognized the name. "She's quiet," the nurse said, "gentle. She asked about you every day." Clara's throat tightened. What did she say? The nurse smiled softly. Only that she hoped you'd come, and that if you didn't, she understood. The room was warm, a little too warm. There were dried flowers by the window. A photograph of a girl, herself, Clara realized, taped to the wall. She didn't remember the picture being taken. Isabelle lay in the bed. Her hair was thin, her hands frail. Her eyes opened slowly. They met Clara's. And for a long moment, neither spoke. Then Isabelle whispered, "You came." Clara sat down. "I came to ask why." Isabelle nodded, tears forming but not falling. "Because I was weak," she said. "Because I was young and afraid. Because I didn't know how to raise a child alone. And because every part of me loved you, except the part that was brave." Clara looked away. "I thought about killing you," Isabelle added. Clara stiffened. "I stood over your crib once, thinking if I ended it now, you wouldn't suffer the life I was dragging you into. But then you smiled in your sleep, and I realized
I couldn't be the reason you stopped breathing. So you became the reason I lived without a mother, Clara said. Yes. That night, Clara didn't leave the hospice. She sat by the window as Isabel slept, listening to the slow hum of the machines. She wasn't sure what she felt. It wasn't love, it wasn't hate. It was a strange ache, a space in her chest that had been cold so long it had forgotten the name of warmth. She remembered the notebook she used to hide under her mattress. She left me. Every page. But what if there was another story? What if the line had been, she couldn't stay, but she never stopped looking back? The next morning, Isabel spoke again. I read a story once, she said, a Zen story. Clara raised an eyebrow. 2 monks carried a woman across a river. One felt guilty for touching her. The other said, I left her at the river. Why are you still carrying her? Clara exhaled. And you think I've been carrying you all this time? No, Isabel said softly. I think you've been carrying the wound. I just happened to be the shape it took. Clara looked at her mother for a long time. Then she stood and walked outside. There was a park nearby, quiet and overgrown. Clara sat on a bench beneath a crooked fig tree. She closed her eyes. She didn't try to forgive. She simply tried to breathe. Isabel died 2 days later. Clara was there. She held her hand in silence. She lit a candle that night, not because she believed in afterlife, but because she didn't want the darkness to be total. Back in Paris, she found the notebook from the orphanage in a sealed box. Every page still said, she left me, except the last. There, in a different hand, shaky, slow, were 4 words. I never stopped looking. Philosophical reflection. In Buddhism, there is a teaching that speaks to the first arrow and the second arrow. The first arrow is what happens to us, pain, betrayal, abandonment. The second arrow is what we do with it, how we cling, resent, replay. Often, it is the second arrow that hurts the most. Clara carried the first arrow her whole life, but it was the second arrow, unforgiveness, that calcified her heart. Zen does not demand reconciliation. It only invites the truth to be held without judgment. In doing so, the wound becomes a doorway, not to reunion, but to release. Psychological reflection. Clara's journey reflects a profound dynamic in trauma healing, the movement from narrative closure to narrative integration. For years, her identity was structured around abandonment. The simple letter disrupted that structure, not by erasing her pain, but by widening its context. Research in developmental psychology shows that children who experience early separation from caregivers often struggle with attachment wounds. But even late in life, when the truth is offered, healing becomes possible, not through repair of the past, but through reauthoring the self. In this case, the act of witnessing her mother's final days and hearing the full story became a mirror, one that didn't deny pain, but gently allowed it to evolve. Closing meditation. Tonight, ask yourself, what story have I been repeating about who left me? What might change if I asked what they were running from, not just what they ran from me? Breathe gently. Not every wound needs a scar. Some need only to be seen. And in that seeing, the child begins to rest. The mother begins to return. And you begin to soften. Story 6. The Room with No Mirror. In the heart of Venice, where alleyways twist like whispered secrets and bridges cradle shadows between sighs, there stood an old building near Campo San Polo, a pale yellow house with green shutters perched just above a silent canal. Apartment number 4 had no mirror.
Not in the hallway, not in the bedroom, not even in the small bathroom tucked behind the kitchen. The glass had been removed long ago. Not broken, not shattered, removed as if erased with care. The woman who lived there was named Elena Moretti. To the neighbors, she was quiet, distant, graceful in the way broken porcelain is graceful, beautiful but not to be touched. She never spoke of the past. She never invited anyone in. But sometimes, in the early dawn, if you walked past her door and listened closely, you might hear music, soft, tragic melodies coming from a dusty record player. Once, Elena had been the most luminous ballerina in all of Italy. Now, she lived in a room without reflections. It had been 20 years since the accident at Teatro La Fenice. Elena was 23, dancing the lead in Giselle when the stage light malfunctioned. A flash, a scream, a fall. She survived. Her partner, Luca, did not. It had not been her fault. But fault has little to do with guilt, and guilt, once planted, grows in silence. After the funeral, she moved into the apartment and removed all mirrors, not out of superstition, but because her eyes, when she looked into them, showed her things she could no longer bear to see. The way his hands once lifted her in midair, the flicker of panic just before the fall, the life that had ended mid-movement. The audience had clapped for 5 full minutes that night, not knowing what had happened behind the curtain. Elena had never danced again. She taught briefly, then stopped. Something in her body no longer trusted rhythm. Her bones remembered too much. The years passed in rituals. She made tea at 6 a.m. every morning, always jasmine. She read one poem before bed, always Neruda or Rilke. She never changed the records. They spun the same symphonies, over and over, as if her grief had its own score. Then one summer, a strange letter arrived. No return address. Inside, a single line. "There is a dancer still inside you. Let her speak." There was no signature, but Elena knew the handwriting. Luca had written her letters once, playful, quick, full of mischief. She had memorized the curves of every L. But he was gone. This couldn't be him. She placed the letter under her pillow, and for the first time in many years, she dreamed. In the dream, she stood on a stage barefoot, no lights, no audience, just the sound of water lapping below the floorboards. She began to move, slowly, painfully, then freely. When she awoke, her legs were aching, as if they had danced without her. The next day, she opened the drawer beneath her bed. Inside was a box wrapped in silk. She hadn't touched it in 2 decades. Inside the box, her old point shoes, yellowed with time, a ribbon Luca had once tied in her hair before a performance, and a photograph, black and white, of the two of them mid-leap, eyes locked, suspended in trust. She held it to her chest. Then, slowly, she stood. She began dancing at night. Not on a stage, in the living room. She moved the furniture, let the moonlight flood through the tall windows, let the creaks in the wooden floor guide her, like an old friend tapping her shoulder. She moved with caution at first. The body remembers both flight and fall. But as the nights passed, her limbs began to forgive her. She didn't look at herself. There were no mirrors after all. Only breath, and space, and the gentle rhythm of returning. One evening, as she twirled silently, she noticed something strange. In the glass of the tall window, just a sliver, barely visible, there was a reflection. Not clear, not sharp, but enough. Enough to show her a silhouette dancing. Not perfectly, but truthfully. She froze. Her chest tightened. Then tears came. Because for the first time in 20 years, she saw herself and did not turn away. The next morning, a knock came at the door. A girl stood there, maybe 16, with wide eyes and trembling fingers. She held a notebook in one hand, a dance shoe in the other. "Are you Elena Moretti?" Elena nodded. The girl's voice was nearly a whisper. "My grandmother said you used to fly." Elena smiled gently. "Your grandmother exaggerates. She said you used to make time stop." Elena opened the door wider. "Come in."
Her name was Sophia. She had seen an old recording of Elena's performance on a VHS tape. She had watched it 100 times. She said she didn't want to dance like Elena, she wanted to feel like Elena looked when she danced. "I don't know what I'm doing," she confessed. "I just know that when I dance, I'm not afraid." Elena nodded. She understood. They practiced every Sunday. Elena didn't teach technique. She taught presence. "Don't try to look beautiful," she said. "Try to disappear." In time, Sophia danced not with her body, but with her soul. And slowly, something in Elena began to loosen. One rainy afternoon, Sophia asked the question no one else had dared. "Why did you stop?" Elena stared out the window. "I fell," she said. "But everyone falls," Sophia replied. Elena turned. "No, I fell, and someone else didn't get up." Silence filled the room. Sophia placed her hand over Elena's. "Maybe he wouldn't want you to stay fallen for both of you." That night, Elena stood before the window again. The reflection was clearer now. Her hair was gray. Her body curved differently. But the fire in her chest, the one she had buried, was flickering again. She placed a hand against the glass and whispered, "Forgive me." And just for a moment, in the reflection, she thought she saw Luca, smiling. Weeks later, Elena went to Teatro La Fenice. She hadn't returned since that night. She stood outside, watching the crowd gather for a new performance. She didn't go in. She didn't need to. She simply bowed her head and let go. Philosophical reflection. In Zen, a mirror is not simply a tool for reflection, it is a metaphor for the mind. A clean mirror shows what is, but when covered in dust, grief, regret, shame, it distorts. Elena removed mirrors from her world to avoid seeing the pain within, but absence does not erase, it delays. Her healing began not when she saw herself, but when she dared to move again. In motion, we return to the present. In movement, the mind clears. The body, like the heart, remembers. But it also forgives. Psychological reflection. Elena's story represents the intersection of trauma, survivor's guilt, and creative repression. After the accident, she externalized her pain by removing all mirrors, symbolically detaching from her identity, her body, her artistry. This avoidance, while seemingly protective, created emotional stagnation. The anonymous letter, real or imagined, acted as a psychological invitation, initiating re-exposure to the traumatic memory through the safe ritual of dance. Sophia's role reflects the reparenting model in therapy, the younger generation providing an opportunity for the wounded self to heal by witnessing innocence, hope, and acceptance again. The mirror, once feared, becomes a portal, not to the past, but to integration. Closing meditation. You may not have removed all the mirrors, but perhaps there's a room in you that remains unvisited. A place where a part of you stopped moving, stopped believing, stopped dancing. Tonight, turn inward, not to judge, not to perform, but to gently witness. Place a hand on your chest. Feel the rhythm. You are still here, and that means the dance is not over. Let the silence carry you. Let the breath guide you.
You don't need a mirror to return. You only need to begin. Story 7. The Man Who Stole from Himself. In a quiet town just outside of Geneva, where the snow fell like whispers and the lake kept secrets in its deep blue heart, there lived a man named Julien Mercier. He owned a tall house with cold windows and smooth marble floors, and drove a black car that purred like an expensive lie. By all accounts, Julien was successful. He wore pressed suits, he spoke with precision, he chaired meetings and signed documents with an effortless flick of the wrist. His face often appeared in magazines beside words like visionary and self-made. But no one really knew who he was after dark. No one knew that each night, before locking his study, Julien opened a small drawer in his desk and stared at an object wrapped in a handkerchief, a coin no larger than a bottle cap. It was old, tarnished, worthless to anyone else. But to Julien, it was the proof of a theft he had never confessed. Because once, long ago, in a dim grocery store in the outskirts of Lyon, a boy with hungry eyes and dirty shoes had stolen that coin from his own father's cash drawer. And that boy was him. Julien had grown up in poverty. His father, Etienne Mercier, ran a tiny corner shop. He was a kind man with a bent back, always humming lullabies while arranging the produce. Julien's mother had died of pneumonia when he was 10, and from then on, silence moved into the house like another sibling. Julien remembered the creak of the wooden floor at dawn, the smell of onions and dust, the cold that never fully left the kitchen. And he remembered watching his father count the coins each night with tired fingers. One evening, when he was 13, Julien saw a 10-franc piece sitting unattended on the counter. And something in him, sharp and sudden, reached out and took it. He used it to buy candy, something sweet, something forbidden. He ate it all in an alleyway, the wrappers curling at his feet like regret. When his father realized the coin was missing, he said nothing. But that night he hummed no lullabies. And something in Julien fractured. He never spoke of it, never returned the coin. Years passed. He left Lyon, studied abroad, clawed his way through business school, built companies from ideas and fire. He bought his suits and his silence in equal measure. But he kept the coin. And each time something good happened, a promotion, a deal, an award, he would open the drawer and look at it, as if to remind himself, this success was stolen. Not from his father, but from the boy he used to be. One winter, Julien received a letter postmarked from Lyon. No return name. Inside was a photo. His father, older, thinner, sitting outside the shop, now barely more than a crumbling storefront. The sign was faded. The smile on Etienne's face was small but real. There was a note. If you're still alive, your old man's still humming. Come before the frost takes the walls. Julien folded the letter and set it aside. For a week, he did nothing. Then one morning, he drove back to Lyon. Not because he wanted to be forgiven, but because he couldn't keep pretending he hadn't already confessed, to the coin, to the drawer, to the aching silence of his soul. The shop looked exactly the same. Dusty, weary, alive. His father stood behind the counter, hunched over a box of lemons. He looked up, blinking. Then his eyes widened, but not in anger. "Julien?" he said. Julien nodded. "Hello, Papa." No embrace, no accusation, only a long pause. Then Etienne gestured to the chair beside the register. "Sit," he said. Julien sat. They drank tea in chipped cups. They spoke of the weather, of the shop, of how the world had become louder and less kind. Not of the past. Until Julien reached into his coat and pulled out the coin. He placed it on the table. Silence settled. "I took this from you," he said. Etienne stared at it for a long time. Then he laughed, a small, dry chuckle. "You're 46, he said, "and that coin's been gone for 33 years. I know. I had always hoped you'd spent it on something good. I spent it on shame." Etienne picked it up, turned it in his palm. "Then maybe it's time you spend it on peace instead." They didn't talk more that day, but the next morning Julien helped him open the shop. He arranged the apples, he swept the dust. He watched his father hum, and something old in his chest began to thaw. Julien stayed for a week. He didn't call the office. He didn't wear a suit. On the last day, before leaving, he asked, "Why didn't you say anything?" Etienne smiled. "Because I knew that one day you'd either forget or return." Julien nodded. "I couldn't forget." His father placed the coin in his hand. "Then you returned." Back in Geneva, Julien didn't place the coin in the drawer. He gave it to a boy, his assistant's son, who was struggling to afford ballet classes. He told him, "This is for your dreams. It's not much, but it has a long history." The boy beamed, and for the first time in his life, Julien smiled without guilt. Philosophical reflection. In Zen, there is a story of a man who crosses a river with a heavy pack. On the far bank, he continues to carry the pack long after it's needed, unaware he is free to let it go. Julian's coin was such a pack. Not because of its value, but because of the meaning he attached to it, proof of wrongdoing, a tether to shame. True confession does not always need an audience. Sometimes it needs only a reckoning with the self, a gaze held long enough to soften. Julien did not steal from his father. He stole from his own innocence. And by returning to it, not to erase, but to acknowledge, he returned to himself. Psychological reflection. This story illustrates the deep impact of early moral injury, a psychological wound incurred when an individual violates their own moral code, especially in formative years. Julian's act of theft, while minor in material terms, became a symbol of disconnection from identity and integrity. The lack of confrontation from his father created an unresolved emotional loop, leading to internalized guilt, which he ritualized through the coin. Such guilt, left untreated, often manifests as perfectionism, emotional detachment, or chronic self-judgment, all present in Julian's adult life. It is the act of returning, literally and metaphorically, that initiates repair. The father's response embodies non-punitive acceptance, a therapeutic stance that allows space for guilt without condemnation. And giving the coin away symbolized not penance, but release. Closing meditation. What memory do you still keep in a drawer? What small moment, unspoken, unresolved, have you let define your worth? Perhaps it was a word left unsaid, a kindness withheld, a silence that became a scar. Breathe. Now open the drawer of your heart. Hold the object gently. Name it, not to punish, but to see it clearly. Then, when you're ready, let it go. Give it away, not to forget, but to be free. Story 8. The Clockmaker of Windermere. In a town that barely had a name, nestled between long-forgotten railway tracks and hills that murmured with fog, lived a man named Eliard Knox. The townsfolk called him the Old Clockmaker, though neither his clocks nor his age ever seemed to change. Windermere was a quiet place, the kind of place where dust clung to porch railings and stories passed more swiftly than mail. Most days, Eliard kept to himself. His shop stood at the corner of Brook and Second, a squat stone building with a crooked sign that read, "Time Repaired." The windows were always fogged, the hinges of the door creaked like arthritic bones, and inside, the smell of brass and pine oil filled the air like a hymn. But Eliard wasn't just known for fixing clocks. He was known for listening, not just to people, but to time itself. Villagers whispered that he could fix more than a broken pendulum. He could ease a racing heart, mend a soul stuck in yesterday, even still the restless ache of guilt that kept a man from sleeping. And so people came, not for their watches, but for themselves. One autumn, a young woman named Beatrice stepped into his shop. Her eyes held that frantic glaze that comes from running too far without resting, and her voice trembled like a violin string held too tight. "My father died last winter," she said, "and I can't stop hearing the ticking of his last words. I wasn't there, and I should have been. I should have said more. I should have—" Eliard looked up from his desk where tiny gears sat like stars scattered across velvet. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, "You're holding time like it's a chain, but it was never made to bind you." She looked confused. Eliard stood, went to a dusty shelf, and pulled out an old metronome. He placed it on the counter and wound it slowly. Tick-tock, tick-tock. He gestured. "Watch." The needle swung, steady as breath. This is the heartbeat of time. Forward, always forward. Never faster than now, never slower than now. Beatrice swallowed hard. "But I feel stuck, like everything I didn't do is frozen in place, replaying." He smiled gently, setting a hand over hers. "Because you're listening backward." That night, Beatrice dreamt of her father, not as he lay dying, but laughing beside a lake when she was 10. The ticking was still there, but softer now. No longer a sentence, a rhythm, one that carried her forward. Word spread again. Eliard's shop became something of a chapel, not one with stained glass or choirs, but one where regret was met with silence, and silence with gentle guidance. A soldier came who couldn't forget the faces of those he left behind. Eliard gave him an hourglass and said, "Turn it when you feel the weight. Let the sand pass through your hands. Count each grain you survived, each one a breath you're still allowed to take." A widower came with a broken pocket watch that had belonged to his wife. She wore it around her neck when the doctor said she wouldn't make the night, and she didn't. Eliard replaced the cracked glass and handed it back. Then let it keep ticking. Let it say, "I still carry her," not her ending. Others came. A man ashamed of a lie told 40 years ago. A child who blamed himself for his parents' divorce. A teacher who couldn't forgive herself for a moment of cruelty. And each time, Eliard didn't give sermons or speeches. He gave silence. And then a clock. Not a new one, but the one they needed. One spring day, a boy no older than 7 entered the shop barefoot and wild-haired, holding a toy hourglass smashed at one end. "It's broken," the boy said, "but I don't want a new one. My sister gave it to me. She said it would help me be patient, but she left." Eliard took the hourglass in both hands and examined it. The sand inside was stuck. He didn't say anything. He just turned it upside down. The sand began to fall again. The boy's eyes widened. "You didn't fix it?" Eliard smiled. "Maybe it didn't need fixing. Maybe it just needed turning." Years passed. Some said Eliard was a monk who'd broken away from his order. Others said he was a widower who never recovered from time's cruelty and vowed to understand it. Some claimed he didn't age because he had found the secret to standing still while the world moved. No one ever saw him eat or sleep. Only tinker, mend, polish, and listen. But one morning, as the crows began to stir and the bakery sent the first scent of bread into the streets, the door of the clock shop remained shut. Unusual. By dusk, concern turned to quiet panic. A few neighbors gathered courage and pried open the door. Inside, the shop was perfectly clean, not dusty, not abandoned, just still, like time had paused to breathe. Eliard was gone. No trace, only a note pinned gently to the doorframe of the workroom. It read, "To mend a clock is to realize it was never truly broken. To hold time is to learn to let it go. If you listen, it will teach you when to stay and when to leave. Thank you for listening. E." On the wall behind the desk hung a single clock. Its hands turned not in circles, but inward, spiraling like a galaxy, quiet, infinite. That was the last anyone saw of Eliard Knox. But stories remain. People still pass through Windermere and ask where the old clockmaker's shop once stood. They find it, eventually. Not the shop, but something left behind. A feeling that maybe time doesn't just tick forward. Maybe it spirals towards something sacred. And maybe healing isn't about stopping time. It's about learning to move with it. Like a breath, like a metronome, like the hands of a clock that, even after all this time, still turn. Story 9. The Man Who Fed Shadows. The desert town of Murado sat quiet at dawn, its buildings glowing gold under the first light. Dust swirled in spirals along the cobbled roads. There was a hush in the air, the kind that made one whisper without knowing why. Elias lived on the edge of that town. A man in his late 50s, he had once been a successful restaurateur in the city. But something in his life had broken. Perhaps it was his heart, perhaps something even deeper. And he had left the world behind to settle in a one-room stone house by the hills. Each morning he would rise before the sun, boil water, and walk barefoot into the wilderness with nothing but a small iron pot and a bag of rice. No one in Murado knew exactly what he was doing. Rumors spread, of course, that he was mad, that he was trying to talk to spirits, that he had lost his wife and was waiting for her ghost. But none of that mattered to Elias. He walked, each day, to a wide canyon where shadows pooled deep under the rocks. And there he would build a fire, cook a pot of simple rice, and ladle it into 3 wooden bowls, placing them at the edge of the canyon. Then he would sit in silence and wait. Not for someone, but for nothing. He never ate the rice himself, never brought it back. He would leave the bowls for the wind, the birds, the dust, whoever came first. Some days, nothing touched them. Other days, the bowls would be empty before he stood to leave. Years passed this way. Until one morning, a young woman named Lila, new to the town, curious and slightly lost, followed Elias from afar. She had heard of the man who fed shadows, and her heart, raw from its own aches, pulled her toward his silence. She watched him from behind a stone ledge as he poured the rice into the bowls. When he stood to go, she stepped out. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to intrude. I wanted to know why." Elias turned to her. His face was lined, his eyes soft like worn velvet. "Why what?" he asked gently. "Why do you feed the shadows?" He looked at her for a moment, then sat again on the stone. "I used to feed people," he said, "in a restaurant. Every night, dozens of them, laughter, wine, full plates. But no matter how much they ate, something stayed hungry. In them. In me." He paused, brushing a grain of rice from his knee. "My wife used to say, 'We're starving, Elias, not from food, but from seeing.' She would walk into a room and notice everything. Who was hiding pain behind their smile? Who needed a kind word? Who had lost someone that week but said nothing? She saw the invisible. "And now?" Lila asked. "Now I try to feed the part of the world that is not seen, the part that hungers for presence, not bread. I don't know if it works, but I sit here each morning and offer what I can." Lila sat beside him. The desert wind curled around them like a long exhale. "But there's no one to eat it." Elias smiled. "Do you know that story," he said, "of the Zen master who said, 'The purpose of the bell is not to be heard, but to ring'?" She shook her head. "It's like that," he said. "The offering is the point, not the outcome. The giving softens me. It quiets the parts of me that still shout." They sat together as the sun rose higher. Eventually, Lila stood. "May I come again?" "You may," he said, "but only if you bring your silence." Zen Parable. There was once a man who had no shoes, and so he wept every morning at the steps of the temple. One day, a wandering monk sat beside him. "I weep," said the man, "because my feet are bare." The monk removed his robe and wrapped the man's feet. The next day, the man returned, barefoot again, weeping louder. The monk, now also barefoot, said nothing. On the third day, the man came once more, but this time he was quiet. He knelt beside the monk, and together they looked at their bare feet. They smiled and said nothing. Philosophical reflection. In our modern world, we are taught to measure meaning by results, to feed and expect someone to eat, to speak and expect to be heard, to work and expect reward. But Zen teaches us the opposite, that action, done without attachment to outcome, is the true liberation.
Elias fed shadows, not because he needed praise or even certainty, but because giving softened the walls inside him. It opened him. It dissolved the boundary between himself and the silent world around him. We often think kindness must have a recipient, but in truth, kindness transforms the giver even when the world doesn't notice. Elias's rice was not for the birds or spirits, it was for the unseen within himself. Psychological reflection. From a therapeutic view, Elias was healing trauma not by processing it intellectually, but by transforming the rhythm of his days. He created ritual, he honored silence, he gave presence a shape, through bowls, fire, rice. This is a common path for those whose grief cannot be resolved through words. Symbolic action becomes the medicine. Lila, in watching Elias, began to understand that not all healing comes from knowing why. Some healing comes simply from being with, from sitting beside someone else's ritual, and letting its slowness rewire your own hurried heart.
Meditative closing. Close your eyes. Breathe softly. Now imagine. You are sitting beside Elias. The canyon stretches wide before you. The sun is gentle. The wind knows your name. In front of you are 3 bowls of warm rice. You don't need to know who they're for. You only need to offer them. As you place them on the stone, feel the release. Feel the soft bow of your spirit toward the unseen. And listen. Perhaps silence is feeding you too.
Story 10. The Boy Who Spoke to the River. The village of Stillwater was named for the river that ran silently through its center, as if the current itself was listening more than flowing. People lived slowly there, planting and harvesting in rhythm with the moon, not the market. There was no clock tower, no train station, and no need for either. The river told the time. Elias, a boy of 10 with eyes like polished slate, lived with his grandmother in a cottage near the bend where the river widened. He was a quiet child, not shy, not afraid, just inward. He rarely spoke, except to the river. And the villagers, though they found it odd, left him to it.
Every morning before the sun rose, Elias walked barefoot to the river's edge. He would kneel, close his eyes, and whisper into the water. Some said he was praying. Others said he was dreaming. But the truth was both simpler and stranger. Elias believed the river spoke back. It had started the year his parents died. A sickness swept through the valley like fire through dry wheat. One by one, homes fell silent, and the only sound was the river's eternal hush. When it was over, Elias was alone, the grief inside him too large to fit into words. So he stopped using them. He stopped speaking altogether, except to the river. He didn't remember when it first happened, only that one morning, after days of silence and sobbing, he sat by the water and said, "Why did they leave me?" And the river, in a ripple that brushed against his fingertips, answered, "Not all that leaves is gone." It wasn't a voice, not like his grandmother's, or the baker's, or the crow's harsh cry. It was more like a knowing, a warmth behind the ribs, a shimmer in his bones. From that day, he returned every morning. He asked questions, and he listened. Years passed, and Elias grew, but the village remained unchanged. The same dusty market, the same creaking mill, the same skeptical glances at the boy who spoke to water. One afternoon, while stacking firewood behind the cottage, Elias overheard his grandmother speaking with the midwife. "He still does it?" the midwife asked. "Talks to the river?" His grandmother sighed. "Every day. And the strange thing is, he's never wrong about the weather, or when the geese will fly, or when the frost will bite. He knows before I do, and I've lived long enough to smell winter in my sleep." The midwife clicked her tongue. "That's not wisdom, that's madness with manners." Elias, hidden behind the shed, didn't feel hurt. He had long stopped expecting understanding. But that night, he walked farther than usual along the river, past the mill, past the willow grove, until he reached the old wooden bridge that nobody used anymore. There, under a pale sky, he whispered, "Am I mad?" The river shimmered under the moonlight, its surface unbroken. Then the current shifted, curled like a cat around a stone, and said, "Would you rather be mad and kind, or sane and cruel?" Elias smiled. "I'd rather be kind." The water glowed. "Then let them call you what they must." As Elias turned 15, the village began to notice other things. The sick child whose fever broke after Elias left a smooth river stone on his windowsill. The lost calf found standing near the bank where Elias had been seen hours earlier. The old farmer who said Elias's hands felt like sunlight when he helped him to his feet. Whispers replaced judgment. The baker now offered him warm bread without charge. The blacksmith, once gruff and dismissive, began tipping his hat. Still, nobody asked Elias what the river said, not even his grandmother. Until the fire. It was mid-autumn when the sky turned black in the north. A forest blaze, furious and fast, devoured trees like matchsticks and raced toward Stillwater. The villagers panicked. Buckets were filled, carts packed, children crying and hens squawking, as if the very ground trembled in warning. That evening, Elias stood in the shallows, unmoving. "What should we do?" he asked. The river was calm, too calm. "Run?" "No," the river answered. "Fight?" "No." "Then what?" The water rose slightly, barely a ripple, and said, "Dig." Elias blinked. "Dig?" "A new path. You must give me room." And so, barefoot and breathless, Elias ran to the square and shouted, "We have to dig a channel, a new path for the river. It will stop the fire." The elders stared. The mayor turned pale. A boy who talks to water wants us to dig a trench while flames eat our fields? But Elias didn't wait. He grabbed a spade and began carving a line into the earth. His grandmother followed, then the baker, then a girl with braids. One by one, hands joined his, and under moonlight and fear, the people of Stillwater dug. At dawn, the fire came. It roared down the hill like thunder on legs, devouring pine and wind. But as it reached the edge of the village, it met the widened river and stopped. The trench, filled now with diverted water, swelled like a silver serpent between flame and home. The fire, choked and stilled, moved no farther. Stillwater was saved. From that day, Elias was no longer the quiet boy by the river. He was the listener, the bridge between what is said and what is felt. But he remained humble. He did not dress in robes or claim to be wise. He never asked for thanks. When people came to him for advice, he simply said, "Let's go ask the river," and walked them to the bank. Some heard answers. Some heard silence. But all left lighter than they came. Years later, long after his grandmother had passed and Stillwater had grown into a village with 2 streets and a clock tower, Elias still walked barefoot to the river each dawn. One morning, a child followed him, a girl no older than 10, eyes bright with curiosity. "Do you really hear it?" she asked. Elias smiled. "I don't hear with my ears." "Then how?" "With the part of me that's quiet." She furrowed her brow. "I don't have that part." He laughed gently. "You will, one day, when the noise inside becomes too heavy, when words feel too small." She sat beside him. "Can I listen too?" Elias nodded. "Close your eyes." And as the morning sun spilled like honey across the water, the girl closed her eyes. There was no voice, no thunder, no miracle. Just stillness, and the sound of her breath sinking with the river's hush. And somewhere deep inside her chest, the faintest shimmer of understanding stirred. She did not speak of it. She didn't need to. The river had begun to teach her too. Story 11. The Song of the Blackbird. The village of Bellwood had no temple, no shrine, no priest. But each spring, the people would gather under the great elm tree to watch the blackbirds return. They came like clockwork, hundreds of them, singing in the wind. Their melody wasn't like the songs of larks or the confident cries of crows. It was softer, more circular. It folded in on itself, like a whisper chasing its own echo. The old man who swept the cobblestones, his name was Elias, said they sang of something forgotten. "Not grief," he would murmur, brushing away fallen petals. "Not joy either. Something deeper, something from before we were born." No one quite knew what he meant. Until the day a woman arrived on foot, shoes torn, eyes like scorched fields after fire. Her name was Rosalie, and though she said little, her silence stirred the entire village. She took up residence in the abandoned weaver's cottage. No one saw her unpack. No one saw her light candles or bring wood. But in the evenings, smoke curled from the chimney, and the smell of something ancient, a broth maybe, or roots drying, drifted through the square. Children were curious. Adults were cautious. But Elias, ever slow in step but sharp in presence, simply left a wooden stool outside her door one morning. A quiet invitation, a gesture of neither demand nor pity. She used it. She sat often on the stool, wrapped in a faded shawl, watching the blackbirds. They were late that year. The villagers said the weather had changed or the skies had confused them, but Rosalie just watched the empty branches with a gaze that said, "They will come. They always come." One afternoon, a child wandered too close and asked what everyone wondered but dared not speak. "Why do you never speak?" Rosalie looked at the child, softly, as if she were looking not at her, but through to some invisible thread. Then she whispered,
I am listening. To what? Rosalie glanced upward, to the silence before the birds. That night, Elias visited her. He brought warm tea brewed with ginger and cinnamon, the kind that lingered in your bones. They sat by the fire, quiet at first. "You lost someone," he said gently, not as a question, but as a truth resting on the rim of a cup. She nodded. "I lost myself." And in the silence that followed, the fire cracked. "I had a son," she finally said. "He was 12. He was quiet. Not shy, just still, like a lake with thoughts beneath. And one day he didn't come home from school." The cup in Elias's hand trembled slightly. He didn't speak. "They found his backpack near the river. His shoes, too. But not him. Never him." The flames danced between them like uncertain thoughts. "I searched," she said, "everywhere, inside every tree hollow, every glint of water, every whisper of a dream. I searched until I couldn't remember why I started." She paused. "Then, one night, I dreamt of a blackbird. It wasn't flying, it was waiting, and in its eyes was the same stillness I saw in him. That's why I came." "To listen?" Elias asked. She smiled faintly. "To remember the part of him that isn't gone." The next morning, the blackbirds arrived. They came not with fanfare, but like a tide returning to a familiar shore. Their song was slow, circling, weaving. Rosalie sat beneath them, her eyes closed, her palms open, as if receiving, as if letting go. Villagers gathered. No one spoke. The sound was untranslatable. It wasn't music in the traditional sense. It didn't rise or fall. It simply was. A spiral, a breath, a returning. Later that evening, a young boy who had listened beside his grandmother asked her, "What are they singing?" The grandmother held him close and replied, "They're not singing to be understood. They're singing to remember." Rosalie remained in Bellwood. She didn't try to explain the birds. She didn't try to be understood. But slowly, her silence became a kind of teaching. She began to sweep the square alongside Elias. She helped carry vegetables from the carts. When someone was sick, she brought warm cloths and whispered stories, not in words, but with her eyes. And every spring, when the blackbirds came, the villagers no longer watched out of curiosity. They listened. They sat still. They brought blankets and old sorrows and let the song wash through them like a river smoothing stones. One spring, Elias passed away. He had grown thin, but not frail, just more and more like wind before it vanishes. His final words to Rosalie were, "You taught us how to listen without needing to fix. That is a gift few carry." Rosalie remained in the village another year. Then, one morning, she was gone, her cottage empty, her shawl folded neatly on the stool outside. Some said she followed the blackbirds. Others said she became one. But the truth was simpler. She had listened deeply enough to remember who she was. And now, she knew how to go home. Zen Parable Reflection. There is a story told in whispers about a monk who sat each day beneath a mountain stream, not to cleanse, not to drink, but simply to listen. One day, another traveler asked what wisdom he had found there. The monk replied, "In the beginning, the stream spoke to me of sorrow. Then it taught me stillness. Now it no longer speaks, but I still hear it." Philosophical reflection. Grief does not ask to be solved. It asks to be witnessed. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of being. When we truly listen, not to reply, not to escape, but to receive,
We are returned to something original in us, something beyond names, beyond loss. Psychological reflection. Modern psychology speaks of holding space. It means being with someone without judgment, without the compulsion to fix or explain. Rosalie held space for her own pain, and through that became a vessel for the healing of others. In a world addicted to noise and answers, the greatest act of love may be this: to sit beside another in their silence and not turn away. Meditative closing. Tonight, if you find yourself restless, do not reach for your phone. Do not run from the ache. Sit still, open the window, and just listen. There may be a blackbird waiting in the branches of your soul, ready to sing you home. Story 12. The Taste of Rain. It had not rained in 12 months. The town of Sonora, perched on the edge of a golden desert, had grown silent beneath the dryness. Once a place of orange trees and singing streams, it now crackled underfoot like brittle paper. The people grew quieter with each sun-scorched week. Even the children no longer played outside, their laughter trapped behind shuttered windows. Among the townspeople was an old man named Ira, who lived in a tiny adobe house at the edge of town, just beyond the chapel. Every morning, regardless of heat or silence, Ira walked the same slow path to the square, carrying an old silver bowl wrapped in linen. He would sit in the middle of the empty plaza, unwrap the bowl, place it beside him, and wait. No one knew why. Some whispered that Ira had once been a monk who lost his way. Others said he was mad from sunstroke or grief. But still, he came each morning and waited, eyes closed, with the silver bowl beside him. One summer day, a boy named Leo, curious and bold in his 10 years, followed Ira after seeing him from his bedroom window. Leo had never spoken to the old man before. He tiptoed through the dust and sat beside him in silence. "Why do you bring the bowl?" Leo finally asked. Ira opened one eye. A faint smile appeared on his weathered face. "To catch the rain," he replied. Leo looked up at the endless, pitiless sky. "But there is no rain." "There will be," Ira said, closing his eyes again. "And when it comes, I want to taste it." Leo frowned. "But you'll be waiting forever." "Maybe," said Ira. "Maybe not." Each morning after that, Leo joined him. At first, it was just curiosity, then habit, then something else. The boy didn't understand why, but sitting beside the old man made the day feel different, softer somehow, slower. "I think people think you're a little odd," Leo said once, as they sat under a sky that showed no sign of mercy. Ira chuckled. "Maybe they're right. Maybe being odd is just remembering things others forget." "Like what?" "Like how the earth once smelled after rain, or how a bowl can be more than a bowl." Leo didn't understand, but he stayed. Weeks passed. The sun bore down. The chapel's bell cracked from heat. The last well in the village gave a cough of dry air. Still, Ira came. Still, he waited. One morning, a woman named Clara approached them. She was once a school teacher, before the children stopped coming. Her face was dry and hard. "Why do you do this?" she demanded. "The whole town is dying, and you sit here with your bowl?" Ira looked up, calm. "I wait." "For what?" "For the world to remember itself." Clara scoffed. "You're wasting time. We need action, not waiting." Ira nodded. "Then act. I won't stop you." She walked away, shaking her head. Leo was quiet that day. He seemed upset. "You okay?" Ira asked. "Is she right? Are you just giving up?" Ira's face remained gentle. "Sitting still doesn't mean I've stopped moving. Some things shift without a sound." Leo mulled that over, but didn't speak. The next morning, Leo brought his own bowl. It was a plastic cereal bowl, blue and chipped. He placed it beside Ira's silver one. "I figured if the rain does come, you might want company," Leo mumbled. Ira smiled. From then on, they sat together, two figures in a dry square, two bowls waiting for something no one else believed in. Then, one night, the wind changed. It came like a whisper, then a howl. Clouds rolled in from the west, thick and low. The town held its breath. And then it happened. The first drop fell at midnight. By dawn, the rain poured like music. The villagers rushed outside in disbelief. They tilted their faces to the sky, mouths open. Children screamed in delight. The earth drank hungrily. But in the center of the square, two bowls sat in silence, filling slowly. Ira and Leo arrived at sunrise, just as the last drops were falling. The bowls were full. Ira sat. Leo did too. Gently, Ira lifted the silver bowl and drank. His eyes closed. He smiled like someone remembering a song. Leo lifted his bowl and sipped. His face changed. "It tastes like," he whispered, unsure. "Like beginning," Ira said. "Like the first breath after forgetting you have lungs." Leo smiled. "I didn't think it would ever happen." Ira looked at the sky. Rain always comes, eventually. The question is whether we remember how to receive it. Zen parable. A student once asked a master, "How long must I wait to be enlightened?" The master replied, "If you wait, it may take 100 years." "Then what should I do?" The master smiled. "Place your bowl in the rain and sit very still." Philosophical reflection. The world often praises action, doing, fixing, solving. But there is a quiet wisdom in the art of waiting. Not the passive kind of waiting rooted in resignation, but the conscious, open-hearted kind. The kind that says, "I trust the universe's rhythm, even when I don't understand it."
Ira's bowl was more than a vessel. It was a symbol of hope, of readiness, of belief that something invisible is worth preparing for. In a culture addicted to urgency, perhaps the deepest practice is patience. Psychological insight, modern life conditions us to control outcomes, to chase, to predict, to avoid disappointment by abandoning expectation. But healthy anticipation, rooted not in anxiety, but in gentle presence, can be healing. It invites us to slow down, to observe our needs without panic, and to cultivate inner stillness even when outer circumstances feel barren. Leo's transformation wasn't just about rain, it was about faith, and the soothing presence of someone who held space for belief when the world had none left. Meditative closing. Tonight, place a bowl by your window, not for water, but as a reminder that you are allowed to pause, that you are not foolish for hoping, that you too can be still and open. When the rain returns, let it find you ready. Even an empty bowl is full of trust. Story 13. The Garden Behind the Wall. In a forgotten quarter of an old European city, where ivy claws at brick and time seems to curl up beneath the arches of narrow streets, there was a small tea shop. Its windows were dusty, its sign had long faded, but still people came. Not many, just enough to keep the kettle warm. The shopkeeper was a man named Elian. He never advertised, he never raised his voice, and if you asked anyone in the neighborhood what he sold, they might say tea, or silence, or something in between. Elian had lived a long life, though he didn't look old. He smiled with the tired wisdom of someone who had watched many seasons pass without clinging to any of them. Behind his shop was a wall, and behind that wall was a garden, but no one had seen it.
No one was invited. Even the children, brave and curious, dared not climb over. There was something sacred about that space, though no one could say why. Then, one rainy afternoon, a woman named Isla stepped into the shop. She was not from the city. She was not looking for tea. She was looking for silence. Her eyes held a trembling grief, the kind that presses against the skin like fog. Her coat was soaked. She did not ask for a menu. Elian simply poured a cup and placed it before her. Chamomile with a touch of honey and lemon. She drank, wordless, and time pooled between them. After a while, she spoke. "Is it true? There's a garden behind this place?" Elian didn't nod. He didn't deny it. He only said, "Some things can't be entered directly, not when we're still holding on to what hurt us." She looked at him with the kind of eyes that demanded no explanation, only permission. He stood up, took a key from beneath the counter, and handed it to her. "There's only one rule," he said gently. "You must leave your shoes and your sorrow at the door." She didn't ask what that meant. She just went, and in that quiet act, a story was born. 2. Zen Parable. A young monk once approached his teacher with a troubled heart. "Master," he said, "I meditate, I study the sutras, I sweep the temple floors, but I still feel the weight of my grief. How can I let it go?" The master walked with him to the river, handed him a clay pot, and said, "Fill this with water and carry it across the bridge without spilling a drop." The monk tried once. The water sloshed out. He tried again and again, until finally, exhausted, he collapsed. "I can't," he cried. "It's impossible." The master nodded. "That pot is your sorrow, and the bridge is life. So long as you grip it with trembling hands, you will spill what's precious and never reach the other side." The monk looked confused. "Then what should I do?" The master smiled. "Break the pot. To recognize it as a companion on the road, not the road itself." And so, when we are invited to enter the garden, we are not asked to forget our pain. We are asked to loosen our grip on it, to take off our shoes, our protections, our layers, and step barefoot into presence. The garden is not somewhere else. It is here, always, behind the wall of what if and why me. 4. Psychological reflection. In clinical psychology, unresolved grief can manifest as prolonged rumination, anxiety, and disconnection from joy. But research also shows that ritual, nature, and stillness are powerful tools for integration. Elan's tea shop represents a transitional space, a threshold between surviving and living. The act of handing Isla a key is a symbolic form of granting agency. She must choose to walk toward healing. The requirement to leave behind sorrow is not an invalidation of her feelings. It is a metaphor for containment, for setting down what is too heavy, even if temporarily, so the nervous system can remember safety again. Psychologically, the garden becomes an imaginal zone, a projection of the safe self, a space where healing isn't forced but allowed. And in giving ourselves permission to enter it, we rewrite the narrative of trauma from one of fracture to one of fluidity. 5. Meditative closing. So ask yourself, what sorrow are you gripping with trembling hands? What would happen if, just for this moment, you set it down? You don't need to solve it. You don't need to fix the past. You only need to soften. There is a garden behind your own walls. It waits patiently. It does not judge. It only invites. Take off your shoes. Step gently. And if you listen, truly listen, you might hear the bird song of your own return. The gate is open. The tea is warm. The garden is yours. Story 14. The Stone at the Bottom. There was a man named Elias who lived at the edge of a salt lake in the northern reaches of Chile. His house was modest, sun-bleached, made of adobe and stone, the kind that cracked in the heat and whistled in the wind. He lived alone, by choice, he'd always claimed. A widower for many years, he found solace in silence and peace in the predictable rhythm of daily life. Each morning, he'd wake with the rising sun, stretch his back, drink bitter black tea, and walk to the lake. Not for any reason but to sit, and watch, and breathe. The locals called him El Silencio, not because he didn't speak, but because he never said more than was necessary. He was kind, always nodding, always listening, but no one ever really knew what he was thinking. Perhaps not even Elias himself. One afternoon, a young traveler named Luca arrived in town, covered in dust and questions. He had been wandering for months, perhaps years, looking for something he could not name. He was tired, thin, and full of restless energy. He had read about the Salt Lake and its fabled stillness in an old traveler's journal. He was drawn to it like a moth to a quiet flame. As he walked through the village, a grocer pointed toward the edge of the lake and said, "Talk to El Silencio. He's the one who sees things clearly." Luca found Elias sitting cross-legged by the shore, watching the pink light shift across the salt flats like the breath of a sleeping god. "You are El Silencio?" Luca asked. Elias didn't answer. He gestured to the ground beside him. Luca sat. They sat for a long time. The wind whispered. The salt cracked beneath their legs. Luca fidgeted, scratched his arms, shifted his weight, and finally said, "I can't stop thinking. My head is always noisy. No matter where I go, it follows me." Elias nodded slightly. Then he stood and walked to a nearby tree. From its shade, he picked up a small sack and brought it back. Inside were smooth river stones, worn by years of water. "Pick one," he said simply. Luca chose a stone the size of a fist, gray, heavy, cool. Elias pointed to the lake. "Throw it in." Luca hesitated, then hurled the stone far into the shimmering stillness. It plopped, disappeared, and the ripples spread in perfect concentric circles until they dissolved into nothing. "Now," Elias said, "bring it back." Luca blinked. "What?" "Go, bring the stone back." "But it's gone." Elias said nothing. He simply looked at Luca with patient eyes that had weathered more storms than the land itself. Luca stood, frustrated. "It's impossible. The water's too deep. I don't even know where it landed." Elias simply nodded, as if that was the answer itself. After a long pause, Elias spoke. "This is what the mind is like when we throw thoughts into it. Worries, regrets, fears. We toss them in, hoping they'll disappear. But the ripple remains, and soon we forget what we threw. We only see the waves. We chase the echo of something we no longer understand." Luca stared out at the lake. The wind had calmed. The water was still again. "So what should I do?" he asked. Elias stood. He walked to the edge of the water, bent down, and scooped up a single handful of briny liquid. He let it fall through his fingers. "You cannot unthrow the stone," he said, "but you can choose whether to keep diving after it or to watch the lake return to stillness." Luca sat again. This time he didn't speak. He watched the lake as Elias did, for what felt like hours. And as the sun began to dip and the sky turned violet and gold, a small sense of quiet grew in his chest. Not an answer, not a revelation, but something deeper. A pause. That evening, he stayed at Elias's home. They shared bread and silence. Over the next several days, Luca returned to the lake. He stopped asking questions. He simply sat. One morning, Elias handed him another stone. Luca turned it over in his hands. It was smooth, white, lighter than the first. He didn't throw it. "I think I'll keep this one," he said. Elias smiled. Zen parable within the story. A monk once asked his teacher, "How do I let go of the thoughts that haunt me?" The teacher said, Have you ever seen a person carry a stone in their hand, cursing it for being heavy? Yes, the monk said. Did the stone ask to be carried? No. Then why do you blame the stone? The monk looked down at his hands. The teacher continued, if you carry a stone for long enough, your hands begin to believe it is part of you. But open your hand, and it vanishes.
Philosophical reflection. What do we carry that is no longer ours to hold? The mind, left to its own devices, collects impressions like pockets gather sand. A word spoken in anger, a failure replayed 1,000 times, a fear dressed up in the future's clothes. These things lodge themselves in us, shaping our experience long after their moment has passed. But memory is not reality. What makes something real is our attention. And like Elias's lake, the mind will always ripple in response to what we cast into it. The trick is not to stop the ripples, but to stop throwing. Let the surface settle. Let the stone rest at the bottom. And slowly, the image becomes clear. Psychological reflection. In modern therapeutic terms, what Elias offered Luca was a form of mindfulness, anchoring in the present without judgment. The stone metaphor reveals the nature of intrusive thoughts. They begin with an impact, and what follows is often the mind's attempt to resist or recover. But the resistance becomes the obsession. Cognitive behavioral therapy often reminds us that thoughts are not facts. We have the right to let go of the narrative. But beyond that, contemplative psychology suggests something deeper, that silence itself is healing, that observation without engagement, the act of simply watching, can dissolve the very impulse that gives thoughts their power. Luca didn't find an answer because there was none to be found. What he found instead was space. And in that space, the mind does what it is naturally built to do, return to calm. Meditative closing. Tonight, sit by the lake of your own mind. Feel the stillness beneath the waves. Let the stone rest where it fell. You no longer need to chase it. Close your eyes. Place one hand on your heart and ask only this: what am I holding that wants to be let go? Stay long enough to hear the answer, not in words, but in the quiet that follows. Breathe. You are not your thoughts. You are the sky. Let the clouds pass and return again to stillness. Story 15. The Stillness Between Notes. It was a small, weathered house perched on the cliffs of a forgotten coast. There were no neighbors, no fences, only the wind and the gulls and the endless hush of waves below. And in this house lived a man named Elias. Elias was a violinist, but he had not played in 7 years. Once he had stood in the golden spotlight of Europe's grandest halls. Audiences would fall silent, breath held as his bow met the strings. The world called him brilliant, gifted, divine. But Elias never quite believed them, because there was always a trembling in his chest, a small tremor in his bow hand, and a voice inside that whispered, "You are playing too fast. You are chasing perfection, not presence. You've lost the stillness." The critics never heard the tremble. The crowds didn't care. But Elias did. And one night, after a performance in Vienna, he set his violin down and walked away. He moved to the coast, alone. He built his days around silence, brewing tea, tending to an overgrown garden, listening to the sea breathe. He read books, meditated. Sometimes he would lift the violin from its case and simply hold it, feeling the weight of memory press into his hands. But he never played, not once. He told himself he was done chasing sound. One evening, as spring unfurled her first warm winds across the cliffs, Elias found a note pinned to his front door. It read,
"I was told the master lives here. I have walked 73 kilometers with only bread and water. May I have a lesson?" It was unsigned. There was no name, no return address, just a scrawled message and the scent of dried lavender on the page. Elias stood there for a long moment. That night, as he sipped his tea beside the fire, he imagined the person who had left it. A young woman? An old monk? A child? He told himself to forget it. But the next morning, he found the same figure sitting cross-legged by the path. It was a girl, perhaps 18, no more than 20, with a knotted scarf around her hair and calluses on her fingers. "You left the note," Elias said. She bowed. "Yes." "And what makes you think I am the one you seek?" She looked at him, eyes steady. "Because you stopped playing." He almost laughed. "That makes me less of a teacher." She shook her head. "It makes you the only one who might understand." Against every instinct, Elias invited her inside. Her name was Mara. She had trained at a conservatory in the city, but left after growing weary of judges, metronomes, and the endless pursuit of flawlessness. She had played in parks, in markets, even for the dead in a village funeral, but she had never been taught the thing she longed to understand. "What is that?" Elias asked. Mara looked down. "Stillness. The space between the notes. I can't find it." Elias said nothing. He poured tea. And thus began her first lesson. They did not play music. Instead, Elias asked her to listen. To the crackle of fire, the hush between waves, the pause in a blackbird's song, the silence between her footsteps on the garden path. Days passed this way, then weeks. Sometimes Mara would grow restless. "I should be practicing," she'd say. "You are," Elias replied. At dawn, they would sit facing the ocean. Elias taught her how to breathe with the wind, how to bow to silence, how to let the world unfold without rushing to meet it. Only after 30 days did Elias say, "Bring your violin." Mara opened the case with care. It was scratched and worn, but her fingers gripped it like an old friend. Elias said, "Play one note." She did. It rang out over the cliffs, clear and imperfect, like a bird with a broken wing. "Again," he said. She played the note again and again, until it ceased being a note and became a presence. "Now," Elias whispered, "wait." She waited. Not because she was told to, but because the silence that followed that note was full, alive. And for the first time in her life, Mara felt the difference. She was not just filling time between notes, she was honoring the space. That day, she wept. Weeks turned to months. Mara learned nothing and everything. She still practiced, but no longer for speed or applause. Her bow slowed. Her phrasing softened. Her pauses deepened. She did not master perfection, but she began to master presence. One morning, Elias handed her a bundle wrapped in dark cloth. It was his own violin, the one he had not touched in 7 years. "You're giving this to me?" she asked. "No," he said. "We will play together." And so they did. In the early light of spring, on the cliffs where the sea breathed and the gulls wheeled above them, they played, slowly, barely more than whispers. But within those notes, something opened. Elias felt it, trembling and terrible and sacred. The stillness had never left. He had simply been afraid to hear it. As their final note faded into silence, Mara bowed. "I will go," she said. He nodded. "Where?" She smiled. "Anywhere the silence can travel." He watched her disappear into the morning fog, violin on her back, feet silent on the path. Years passed. No one heard from Elias again. He was said to have died in that house by the sea, peacefully, a faint trace of salt on his lips. But somewhere, In cities and villages, in forests and train stations, at weddings and funerals, people swore they'd seen a girl with fire-dark eyes and a scratched violin. She would play a single note, then fall silent, and in that silence, something inside you would bloom, or break, or remember. And though she never gave her name, some called her the one who played the silence. Zen parable insertion. Long ago, a monk asked Master Wu, "How do I achieve enlightenment?" The master replied, "Listen for the bell that does not ring." Years later, the monk was seen sitting alone in the mountains, smiling at nothing. Philosophical commentary. In life, we often chase the performance, the approval, the result, the next note. We fill every moment, afraid of emptiness. But what if it is in the stillness, not the sound, where meaning resides? To honor the pause is to remember, we are not here to impress the world. We are here to meet it fully, even in silence. Psychological reflection. Much like Elias and Mara, many of us have internalized the idea that self-worth lies in action, output, and success. Yet in modern psychology, mindfulness invites us back to awareness, not of what is done, but what is. To pause without guilt is to reclaim our humanity. Meditative ending. Close your eyes. Imagine one note. Hold it. Then let it go. And listen to what remains. You are still here. And that is enough. Story 16. The Bell in the Fog. Fog had wrapped itself around the tiny seaside town of Bellshore like a heavy wool blanket. The harbor was a ghost of itself. Ships disappeared into silence, and gulls cried into nothingness. In this shroud of mist, the only sound that echoed clearly was the ringing of the old monastery bell perched high on Windcliff Hill. It was rung every evening at precisely 6. Locals said the bell had once been struck to guide lost fishermen home through the thick fog, long before GPS or sonar. Now it rang mostly for tradition, and for the monks who still lived there, tending to their simple lives in the old stone sanctuary. Among those monks was Brother Elias, a man in his 60s with soft gray eyes and a spine that bent slightly, as though he had been bowing for too many years. His robe smelled faintly of cedar wood and salt, and his presence was one that calmed the air around him. He was known by many in town as the one who listens, because no matter what you brought to him, loss, confusion, anger, he would receive it with full attention and respond with a silence that often spoke louder than words. One evening, as the bell rang out through the dense fog, a stranger arrived at the monastery gates. She was young, perhaps in her early 30s, dressed in layers that looked expensive but worn thin by travel. Her name was Simone. She said nothing at first. She simply stood beneath the lantern near the entrance, her hand gripping the iron gate. Brother Elias, who had just finished his tea, felt her presence before he saw her. "Come in," he said softly. She hesitated. "I'm not here for religion," she stated bluntly. Elias smiled. "That's a good place to start. Most who come looking for religion never find truth. But those who come with nothing sometimes leave with everything." Simone looked unsure, but she stepped inside. Over the next few days, she remained in silence. She didn't participate in chants, nor did she ask questions. She would sit by herself in the garden, her eyes often scanning the mist-covered sea, as though searching for something long lost. On the 5th day, Elias approached her gently. "Have you found what you're looking for?" She looked up at him. "No, but I haven't stopped searching either." "And what is it that you've lost?" he asked. Simone hesitated. "My brother. He died 3 years ago in a climbing accident in the Alps. We were close. He was all I had." Elias didn't speak. He simply sat beside her. I've tried everything, she said. Therapists, yoga retreats, psychedelic journeys. I've read every book on grief I could find. But it's like I'm stuck in this fog, just like this town. I can't see forward and I can't see back. The wind tugged at the edges of her scarf.
Elias pointed toward the bell tower. Do you know why we ring the bell every evening? To honor tradition, she guessed. He shook his head. To remember. Remember what? That even when we can't see the shore, the sound still reaches us. Simone was quiet. Elias continued. The fog will always come. In life, we lose people. Dreams fall apart. Our plans dissolve. But there is always a bell somewhere, something that reminds us we are not completely lost. She nodded, though her face was still clouded. Would you like to ring it with me tonight? He asked. She seemed surprised. Can anyone do that? Anyone with ears to listen and hands willing to reach.
That evening, as the sun disappeared behind a curtain of fog, Simone followed Elias up the spiral stairs of the bell tower. The air grew colder with each step, but her heart warmed oddly with anticipation. When they reached the top, Elias showed her the rope. It's heavy, he warned, just like grief. But you don't pull it with force. You give it rhythm. You listen to it as much as it listens to you. She took the rope in both hands. The first pull was awkward. The bell barely moved. On the second pull, she found a rhythm. By the third, the sound rang true. It was deep, resonant, timeless. As she rang it, Simone began to cry. Not the tight-chested, silent kind of crying she had grown used to, but the open, shaking kind, where breath and sobs meet in waves. She didn't stop for a long time. When she finally did, Elias was still beside her, silent. "Why does it feel like I'm letting go?" she whispered. "Because maybe, for the first time," Elias said gently, "you are not trying to escape the fog, but letting the bell be heard through it." They stood there until the air grew colder. The next morning, Simone rose before dawn. She walked through the monastery garden, barefoot on the stone path. Dew clung to the leaves like memory to a photograph. She sat on a bench overlooking the sea. The fog was still thick. But this time it didn't frighten her. Later that day, she packed her things. Before she left, she found Elias trimming the bonsai trees. "I still miss him," she said. "You always will," Elias replied. "But now, maybe the missing becomes part of the music." She smiled. "Thank you," she said, "not for answers, but for silence." He bowed slightly. She stepped through the gate and disappeared into the mist, just as the bell began to ring once more. Zen Parable Reflection. Long ago, a Zen master told a disciple to strike a wooden clapper during meditation. The disciple asked, "Why do we strike the clapper if no one is listening?" The master replied, "Because even the fog listens, and the soul you lost may still be near enough to hear." Philosophical commentary. This story is not about solving grief, but accepting its rhythm. The bell in the fog is a metaphor for inner clarity amidst emotional obscurity. Many spiritual seekers search for light, but in Zen, we learn to sit with the mist, to let it teach us patience, and to recognize that resonance, like love, travels even when sight fails. Psychological reflection. Grief is not linear. It moves like the ocean tide. Often, we want to escape it through methods, tools, or distractions. But sometimes, the most healing act is not to run, but to ring the bell, to acknowledge the loss aloud. This story highlights the power of ritual and embodiment, how physical action, like ringing the bell, can help reintegrate the mind and heart. Meditative closing. Tonight, listen. Is there a bell in your life that needs ringing? Not to call anyone else, but to remind yourself that even through your fog, your voice still echoes. Close your eyes. Breathe deeply. Let the silence hold you as the bell rings softly within. Story 17. The Stone Bridge in Belgrave. In the sleepy village of Belgrave, nestled between gentle hills and lavender fields, there stood an old stone bridge that connected two halves of a town barely touched by time. Nobody knew exactly when the bridge had been built. Some said it was Roman, others believed it was medieval, but everyone agreed it had always been there, like the river itself. Lena, a landscape painter in her late 30s, had recently moved to Belgrave after a long divorce. She left the clamor of London behind, along with a studio that had become more of a cage than a sanctuary. In Belgrave, things were still. The birds didn't hurry, and neither did the people. It was a place where tea was still poured slowly, and where silence wasn't considered awkward, it was respected. Each morning, Lena walked to the stone bridge with her easel and canvas. She didn't paint the bridge, though. She painted what lay around it. The reflections, the children playing with sticks in the stream, the occasional heron resting on its mossy stones. But more than painting, she came there to think, or rather, to stop thinking. The bridge became her anchor. One morning in early autumn, while the mist still hovered like ghosts over the grass, she met a man standing on the bridge. He wasn't from the village. His jacket was too sharp, his shoes too clean. He stood motionless, hands in pockets, looking down into the slow-moving water. Lena didn't disturb him. She simply set up her easel and started sketching the fog. The next morning, he was there again, and the one after that. On the fourth morning, he spoke. "You see something here worth returning for?" His voice was even, almost weary, but not unkind. Lena, not looking up, replied, "Silence, space, time to notice things again." He nodded, as though those words had passed through him before. "I used to come here with my brother when we were kids. We'd race sticks under the bridge. The winner would get a chocolate bar. He always won. I always cheated. He let me." Lena looked up for the first time. His face was marked by something deeper than age, grief perhaps. But he didn't wear it with drama. It was simply part of him, like lichen on the stone. "What brings you back?" she asked. He hesitated, then offered a thin smile. "Guilt, maybe, or the hope that places remember you when people no longer do." They stood in silence. A bird darted through the fog and disappeared behind the trees. Over the next few weeks, their conversations became longer. He introduced himself as Simon, a corporate mediator from Manchester who had taken a leave of absence. He didn't explain why, and Lena didn't ask. They shared tea once. He watched her paint and sometimes pointed out a detail she had missed, a faint ripple, the curled toe of a child wading barefoot. He had an eye, and perhaps a heart that had long been buried. One day, Lena finally asked, "What happened to your brother?" Simon's hands tensed, then relaxed. "He died 4 years ago, drowned, right here." She stopped painting. "No one knows if it was an accident," he continued. "He suffered from bipolar disorder. Some days he was sunlight, some days shadow. We all failed him in different ways." Lena said nothing. Her silence held space for his words. Simon's voice dropped. "I hadn't spoken to him for almost a year before it happened. Stupid argument. And then, he was gone. No bridge left between us." The metaphor lingered, uncomfortably perfect. They didn't speak about it again, but from then on, Simon's visits became more erratic. Some days he showed up late, others not at all. Lena continued painting. One morning, after a heavy rain, he appeared soaked and placed a single stone on the bridge's railing. "What's that for?" she asked. "In a Zen monastery I visited in Kyoto," he said, "they placed stones on the path to indicate someone had been there, to acknowledge the moment. I thought I'd leave one every day I show up. After he left, Lena picked up the stone and held it. It was ordinary, just damp slate, but it carried weight, not just physically, but emotionally. The gesture reminded her of something she once read. A stone is not heavy when you place it down with love. Days passed, then weeks. Simon didn't return. Winter came early that year, coating the village in frost and memory. Lena still went to the bridge, but her paintings grew more abstract. Swirls of gray, layers of white over white. One morning, on impulse, she placed a stone on the bridge herself, then another the next day. It became a ritual, not for Simon anymore, but for everyone she'd lost. Her father, her sister, her younger self. With each stone, she whispered a name, a sorrow, a forgiveness. Then, one spring morning, as the river thawed and robins returned to the hedges, Simon appeared. He looked thinner, tired, but clear-eyed. "I was in Glasgow," he said, "volunteering, building gardens in mental health centers. It helped." "I kept the bridge company," Lena replied, smiling. He noticed the stones. "You remembered." "I needed to," she said, "for more than just you." They walked the length of the bridge together in silence. Lena suddenly turned to him. "Do you think places heal people?" Simon considered the question. "I think people heal when they allow themselves to stand still long enough. Places like this just remind us to stop running." As they reached the end of the bridge, Simon paused. "I never said goodbye to him, never had a ritual. Maybe that's why I kept coming back here." Lena picked up a flat stone and handed it to him. He stared at it for a long time, then whispered something Lena couldn't hear and gently tossed the stone into the water. It skipped once, twice, then sank. The ripple faded. So did the weight in his shoulders. That day, Lena began a new canvas. She painted not what she saw, but what she felt. A still river, a stone mid-flight, and two figures on a bridge, each carrying less than they once did. Zen parable segment woven into narrative reflection. A young monk once asked the master, "How do I let go of guilt?" The master pointed to a large sack of stones the monk was carrying. "Drop one each day," he said, "until you forget why you ever picked them up." Philosophical commentary. We build bridges not only between places, but between people, between moments, and between versions of ourselves. When grief breaks those bridges, we often wander, lost in silence, circling the site of the collapse, searching for what cannot be rebuilt in the same form. But healing does not always come through answers. Sometimes it arrives through ritual, through presence, through the sacred act of showing up, even with nothing to say. Psychological reflection. Guilt, unlike regret, often lingers not because of the event itself, but because of what remains unsaid. We carry emotional stones, unforgiven moments, self-blame, missed goodbyes. Somatic therapy often emphasizes symbolic gestures to reprocess emotion, lighting a candle, speaking aloud, placing an object in nature. In Lena and Simon's story, the stones become a somatic language, a quiet acknowledgement of pain, and eventually a vehicle for its release. Healing begins when grief is allowed to exist without resistance. Meditative closing. As you finish this story, consider this. What stones are you still carrying? Whose names still echo in the chambers of your memory? Tonight, if you can, place a small stone somewhere meaningful. Let it stand for something you no longer need to hold alone. Not to forget, but to remember gently. You are not your sorrow. You are the river that carries it, and the bridge that crosses it. Story 18. The Man Who Built a Staircase to the Moon. In a village nestled between the red plains and the whispering trees, there lived a man named Elias Gray. He was neither old nor young, neither rich nor poor. He was simply Elias. People in the town knew him for his silence. He would nod politely when greeted, offer a small smile, but spoke rarely. Instead, he spent his days carving wood, collecting stones, and walking through the hills at dusk. Some thought he was lonely. Others believed he was a little strange. But no one ever thought to ask him what he was building. Because Elias was always building. He had once taken all the stones from the riverbed and arranged them into concentric circles on the edge of town. Another time, he had stacked hundreds of driftwood logs into the shape of a spiral that pointed toward the northern sky. These structures would last only a few days before rain, wind, or the curious hands of children took them apart. But Elias never seemed to mind. He would simply begin again, quietly, patiently, with eyes that looked far beyond the village. Then, one autumn morning, after the leaves had turned to fire and the geese had long flown south, Elias did something no one expected. He began to build upward. It started with a wooden frame, just a few feet tall. Then he added stone, bound with mud and bark. Then more wood, more stone, carefully balanced. He called it a staircase, though no one knew where it led. Every morning before the sun rose, he worked. And every evening, as darkness fell, he'd sit at the base and look up at the moon. "Elias," said the mayor one day, stopping beside the strange spiral tower, "what are you doing?" Elias, brushing dust from his hands, answered gently, "I'm building a staircase to the moon." The mayor blinked. "To the moon?" Elias nodded. "Yes, I have questions." The mayor shook his head and walked away, muttering about madness. But word spread. Children came to watch, then teenagers, then travelers from nearby towns. They laughed at first, then they stayed, silently, as Elias added layer after layer, wood, stone, rope, even paper. The staircase twisted like a dragon's tail, reaching higher than the rooftops, then higher still. At night, people gathered around fires and whispered, "Why the moon? Does he think he'll get answers from it? Maybe he just wants to disappear." Elias never explained. He never asked for help, but he never turned anyone away either. Then, one night, under a full silver moon, the staircase was finished. It stood like a skeleton of a forgotten god, fragile, crooked, but impossibly tall. It swayed gently in the wind, creaking like it had a heartbeat. The entire village gathered. Elias stood at the base, wearing a simple coat and holding nothing. Someone asked, "Are you going to climb it?" He nodded. Another voice cried out, "But it's not safe, you'll fall." Elias smiled. "Perhaps, but I've already fallen, many years ago. Now I'd just like to rise." With that, he placed his foot on the first step. Silence. Not a bird, not a breath, not a cough. Step by step, he climbed. Slowly, with reverence. Each step groaned under his weight. The crowd gasped as the wind pushed gently against the tower. But Elias did not look down. His eyes were fixed upward. Halfway up, someone whispered, "Why is he really doing this?" An old woman near the back answered softly, "Because when your soul is full of longing, even the sky doesn't feel high enough." Elias reached the top as the moon hovered like a glowing pearl. And then he sat. He did not leap, he did not shout. He simply sat, legs dangling over the edge, eyes wide open, bathed in moonlight. Hours passed. When dawn crept in, pink and shy, Elias climbed back down. The villagers parted as he walked among them, barefoot, smiling. Someone asked, "Did you find what you were looking for?" Elias replied, "No, but I heard something." "What was it?" He paused, eyes soft. "The moon said nothing, but in her silence I heard my own voice again." From that day on, Elias no longer built towers, but others did. Children began making ladders from sticks and painting them silver. Teenagers wrote poems on paper lanterns and sent them floating into the sky. Even the mayor, one night after too much wine, was seen laying stones in the shape of a spiral on the grass. The town changed, not because of what Elias built, but because he dared to ask. Not for answers, but for wonder. Zen Parable Reflection. There's a well-known koan from the Zen tradition. A monk asked, "What is the path?" The master said, "Everyday life is the path." The monk asked, "Can it be studied?" The master replied, "If you try to study it, you will be far from it." Elias's staircase was not about escape. It was not a path away. It was a return to the deep ache within every human soul to ask questions without answers, to reach for things that cannot be held, and to find peace not in completion, but in the courage to begin.
Psychological reflection. In psychology, the act of symbolic expression, through art, construction, or storytelling, is one of the deepest ways a person can externalize the unconscious. Elias, in his quiet ritual, was not delusional. He was healing. His staircase was a container for grief, wonder, and the timeless need to connect with something larger than the self. Often, in modern life, we are discouraged from asking why. Practicality drowns mystery. But Elias reminds us that the sacred is not in the result, it is in the intention. When we build our own staircase, be it through music, writing, walking alone, or lighting a candle, we reconnect with the inner child who once believed the moon could hear. Meditative closing. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture your own staircase, not of wood or stone, but of memory. Where does it begin? What do you hope is waiting at the top? And now ask yourself, what if the moon isn't there to answer? What if she's there simply to listen? Let that be enough.
Story 19. The Gardener Who Spoke to Stones. In a quiet corner of the Scottish Highlands, far from cities, motorways, or even reliable phone signals, there lived a woman named Eilith. Her name meant sunlight in the old Gaelic tongue, though she was more like a mist, gentle, unobtrusive, but always present. Eilith was a gardener, not by trade, but by devotion. Her small stone cottage was surrounded not by ornamental flowers or manicured hedges, but by wild herbs, moss-covered stones, and trees that whispered secrets to the wind. Locals believed she was strange. "She talks to her garden," said the baker with a chuckle. "I think she sleeps in the soil," added the postman, shaking his head. But no one ever mocked her with cruelty. There was something sacred about her solitude, and those who ventured too close to ridicule her often found themselves disarmed by her still gaze. What they didn't know was that Eilith's garden wasn't simply a collection of plants. It was a temple, a breathing, living mandala of the earth's memory. She began each morning at sunrise, barefoot and silent. She moved through dew-drenched ferns and kneeled by the riverstone path she had laid over decades. She pressed her palms to the mossy boulders, not with a purpose, but with presence. "I am here," she would whisper, "and so are you." Eilith believed stones carried memory. Long before she ever heard of Zen or of Buddhism or of meditation, she had discovered the profound truth of stillness. As a child, she had once been caught in a landslide that took the lives of 2 sheep and nearly crushed her beneath a cascade of granite. But what she remembered most wasn't the panic, it was the silence afterward. As dust settled, the stones themselves seemed to breathe. They were not dead things, she realized. They were waiting. From that day, she listened to stones. One autumn afternoon, a young man named Finn, recently heartbroken and spiritually lost, arrived from Glasgow. A friend had told him, half-jokingly, "Go see the stone whisperer in Glendremain. Maybe she'll put your soul back in one piece." So he did. He arrived with a large backpack, city shoes, and headphones that had long stopped playing music. Elith met him at the gate, not with words, but with a nod. She held open the creaking wooden fence and motioned toward a flat stone near the herb circle. "Sit," she said, and he did. What should I do?" he asked. "Feel the stone," she replied. "Wait until it speaks." Finn shifted awkwardly. The stone was cool, slightly wet from morning mist. He felt ridiculous. "Do you expect me to hallucinate or something?" he muttered. Elith said nothing. She walked away, barefoot, her long gray tunic fluttering like a soft moth in the breeze. Finn sat. An hour passed, then another. He stood, stretched, paced, checked his phone for signal. Nothing. He sat again. At some point, he stopped watching the clouds and began listening, not with his ears, but with something slower. The breeze rustled the trees with no urgency. The birds sang as if they had sung the same note 1,000 years ago. The stone beneath him was unmoving, but not mute. It hummed, not in sound, but in vibration, a deep, unfathomable stillness. That evening, Aelid served him nettle soup and barley bread by candlelight. They didn't talk much. "You were in pain when you came," she said after a while. "I still am." "Yes," she nodded, "but now your pain has space to echo." That night, Finn slept in the guest room, a humble loft above the garden shed. The next morning he returned to the stone. He sat without instruction. Hours passed. On the third day, he wept. On the fifth, he said goodbye. But he came back 2 months later. And again the next spring. Word began to spread, not by marketing, but through hushed conversations in cafes and tearful referrals in therapists' offices. Artists, monks, divorcees, war veterans, they came and sat. Some left the same day. Some stayed a week. Some left behind a stone, wrapped in cloth, as a silent offering. Aelid never charged them. "The earth has already paid," she'd say, brushing dirt from her knees. One summer, a documentary filmmaker named Lena arrived. She had won awards, traveled the globe, filmed survivors of earthquakes and revolutions. But she came now not to film Aelid, but to escape the incessant buzz of storytelling. She wanted to stop telling other people's truths and remember her own. She stayed a month. Before leaving, she asked Aelid, "Why do the stones matter so much to you?" Aelid smiled, the first smile Lena had seen from her. "Because they do nothing and remain unchanged, and yet everything flows around them. We think wisdom is in movement, in progress, but it's also in stillness, in being unchanged by what passes." Lena paused. "That sounds Zen." Aelid shrugged. "I don't know about Zen, but I know that grief softens here, anger quiets, even names don't shout so loudly." Before she left, Lena left her camera by the stone. She never filmed anything. Years passed. Aelid's hair turned silver, her back bent more deeply. The garden grew wilder, but never out of harmony. Those who had once sat in her sanctuary began to build their own stone circles in the cities, on balconies, in basements, in recovery centers, and hospice gardens. Finn became a landscape architect who designed healing gardens in hospitals. Lena taught silent retreats for burned-out storytellers. And once a year, without fail, they returned to Aelid. Until one year, they came and found the gate open, but the cottage still. A note, pressed beneath a smooth river stone, rested on the stone bench. "Everything I have ever said is already here. Everything I could teach is beneath you now. I have gone, but only in form. The stone remembers. Sit, and you will too." She had died in her sleep. No funeral. Just the wind rustling the trees and the mist folding over the stone like a soft exhale. They buried her under the largest stone in the garden. No marker, no plaque, just moss, silence, and memory. Zen parable. A student once asked his master, "How can I attain enlightenment?" The master pointed to a large stone in the garden. "Ask that stone." The student frowned, "But it cannot speak." The master replied, "Neither can your mind when it is full of questions." Philosophical reflection. Aelid's story is not about isolation, but immersion. She lived not apart from the world, but deep within its pulse, at a slower rhythm. The stone in her garden was not magical, but it was a mirror. When we sit with stillness, we begin to see our mind's turbulence as temporary. Like water settling in a jar, clarity comes not from more movement, but less. Psychological insight. Modern anxiety often stems from overstimulation and disconnection, from others, from nature, and from the inner self. Stillness is not passive, it is reparative. Trauma survivors often struggle to do their way into healing, but sometimes being with presence, through mindfulness, nature, or even touching the earth, creates the spaciousness needed for integration. Meditative closing. As you breathe now, imagine sitting upon a stone warmed by the sun. Feel its age, its patience. What emotions arise? What thoughts drift like leaves on a pond? Let them come. Let them go. You do not need to answer. You only need to sit. And when you rise, carry that stillness with you into the noise of your day. For even in the loudest city, the stone remains beneath your feet, waiting, listening, and remembering. Story 20. The Monk and the Mirror. In the cobblestone town of Langenfeld, nestled in the hills of northern Germany, there lived an unusual monk named Brother Elias. Unlike the other monks of St. Wilhelm's Abbey, who preferred cloisters and liturgies, Brother Elias spent his days in an abandoned greenhouse, repairing broken things. Shattered clocks, torn umbrellas, music boxes with no melody left. The townspeople, at first, thought him peculiar. A monk who tinkered instead of prayed? But over time, whispers of his kindness spread. How he fixed Mrs. Braun's grandfather clock without charge. How he sat by the river with the widower Herr Meyer just to listen. He asked for nothing but silence in return. One rainy morning, a young woman named Clara arrived at the abbey. She was pale, exhausted, and soaked through her coat. She asked for Brother Elias specifically. He welcomed her without question. Inside the warm glass house, surrounded by succulents and steam, Clara sat on an overturned barrel as Elias brewed tea. "I heard you fix broken things," she whispered. "I try," he replied gently, "though some things resist being mended." She removed a small mirror from her satchel. The frame was cracked, and the glass spidered with 100 lines. "This was my mother's," Clara said. "It shattered the day she died. I keep it hidden because I can't bear to look into it." Elias did not touch the mirror. "And what would you like me to do with it?" he asked. "Fix it, if you can," she said. Then, after a long pause, "But maybe leave it broken." Elias studied her carefully, not the mirror, but her, the tremor in her hand, the weight she carried, not in her arms, but behind her eyes. "Would you walk with me?" he asked. Clara hesitated, then nodded. They wandered into the monastery's garden, wet with dew and spring rain. A silence stretched between them, not heavy, not awkward, just full. Elias spoke softly. "You know, in Japan, there's a practice called kintsugi. When a bowl breaks, it's not discarded. Instead, it's repaired with gold. The cracks become part of its history, visible, celebrated." Clara looked at him. "So they don't hide the damage?" "They honor it," he said, "because what is broken has a story." They sat on a bench beneath a cherry tree, its blossoms dripping with rain. She sighed. "I've spent so long trying to hide how much it hurt. When my mother died, I stopped playing piano. I stopped painting. I stopped laughing." "And the mirror?" Elias asked. "It was the last thing she touched before leaving for the hospital. I dropped it when they called to say she was gone." Elias nodded slowly. "You carry her in that moment, and perhaps that moment lives in the cracks." "I thought maybe if I fixed the mirror, I could fix something in me too," she said, voice breaking. "Or perhaps," Elias said gently, "you don't need to fix either. Just see them differently." Back in the greenhouse, Elias brought out a wooden box filled with odd tools and glues, but instead of sealing the cracks, he inlaid each one with silver thread. The lines shimmered, not like scars, but veins of light. "It's beautiful," Clara whispered when she saw it. "It was always beautiful," he said. "Now it simply shows you what it has endured." As she held it up, the fractured reflection showed her eyes, older than she remembered, wiser than she feared. And then she smiled. Not the smile of someone whose grief had vanished, but the smile of someone who had made space for it. She stayed in Langenfeld for another week, played piano in the old chapel, walked with Brother Elias through morning fog and twilight rain. On the last evening, she gave him a painting, her first in years. It was of the greenhouse, glowing with life. Elias accepted it without words. As she boarded the train back to the city, she kept the mirror in her lap, not to see herself, but to remember that broken things can shine too. Zen Parable Reflection. A disciple once asked a master, "What should I do when I feel broken?" The master held up a cracked bowl filled with water. "Drink from it," he said. "Let it remind you that what holds your suffering also holds your healing." Philosophical insight. This story reminds us that healing is not about returning to what was, but embracing what is. Just as Elias inlays cracks with silver, we too can acknowledge our brokenness without shame. Beauty is not found in perfection, but in honest acceptance. Psychological reflection. Grief often isolates us in the belief that we must move on or get over the pain. But healing is not linear. It happens in the quiet acts of remembrance, in finding new meaning through the pain. The mirror symbolizes the self, a self forever changed but never diminished. Meditative closing. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine the cracks in your heart filled not with sorrow, but with silver light. Let them remind you of what you've endured and how you are still whole. "Do not seek to erase your story," said the Zen master. "Let it echo with grace. Breathe in, hold. Breathe out, let go. You are not broken. You are becoming." Story 21. The Bamboo Path. In a remote valley hidden behind a ring of misty hills, there was a monastery known simply as the Place of the Bamboo Wind. Unlike other monasteries carved from stone or perched atop cliffs, this one was built entirely from bamboo, walls, walkways, and even the sleeping mats. It stood in harmony with the swaying groves that surrounded it, like a whisper rather than a fortress. The monks here were few, old, and mostly silent. They didn't chant loudly or seek converts. They didn't name their practices. They simply lived, in rhythm with the rain, the wind, and the silence between each breath. It was here that a boy named Toma arrived, carrying only a torn satchel and a weight he could not name. Toma had walked for days, fleeing a war he had not started, carrying grief he had not earned. His parents were gone, his village reduced to memory. He had no language for what he felt, only the ache in his chest and the silence that pressed on his skin like a second coat. He was taken in without question. An old monk with cloud-white eyebrows named Master Anji gave him a bowl of rice and a bed of leaves. They did not ask his name, nor why he had come. Only after a week of silence did Master Anji speak. "Would you like to sweep the bamboo path?" Toma nodded. He was given a worn broom of straw and led to a winding trail that carved its way through the tall bamboo. Each morning, Toma swept in silence, removing fallen leaves that would return the next day. Each evening, he ate quietly among the monks and listened to the night frogs sing. Weeks passed, then months, and slowly the silence became a friend. One afternoon, as Toma swept, he paused to rest beneath an old bamboo tree with a deep curve in its trunk. Master Anji appeared beside him, silent as mist. "You sweep very well," the old monk said. "But the leaves come back every day." "Yes," Anji smiled, "and yet you sweep? Doesn't that make it pointless?" The old monk sat beside him. "Let me tell you a story," Anji said. "Once there was a monk who was asked to carry water every day from a distant stream to the kitchen. He had 2 buckets, one perfect, the other cracked. Each time he returned, the cracked bucket had lost half its water. Toma listened, the broom resting across his lap. The perfect bucket mocked the cracked one. "You're worthless," it said. "You spill more than you keep." The cracked bucket wept, ashamed. But the monk smiled and said, "Look at the path we walk. On one side, flowers bloomed where the water had spilled. Because of you," the monk said, "the path is alive." Toma said nothing, but the curve of his shoulders changed. That night, he dreamed of his mother's laughter and the sound of her comb brushing her long hair. He woke with tears on his cheek and for the first time did not wipe them away. The next morning, he swept the path with reverence, not for the sake of cleanliness, but for the moment itself. Years passed. Toma grew taller, his limbs lean and his eyes quiet. He spoke little, but observed everything. The way dew collected on certain stones, how wind moved differently after a storm, how the bamboo whispered secrets in gusts. He did not ask for teachings, but they came. Master Anji would sit with him under moonlight and offer riddles without answers. What shape does the wind take? When you look at water, do you see yourself or the sky? Is silence empty or is it full? Toma did not try to solve them. He let them echo. Then, one winter, Master Anji fell ill. The monks gathered quietly. No panic, no resistance, just warmth, tea, and time. Toma sat by the old monk's bed each night, offering warm cloths and stories from dreams. On the 7th night, as the snow fell in soft spirals, Anji reached for Toma's hand. "Do you know why I asked you to sweep the path?" Toma nodded faintly. "To teach me discipline?" The monk smiled, shaking his head. "To teach you impermanence." Toma looked away, throat tight. "You came to us broken," Anji whispered. "You wanted something fixed. But healing is not fixing, it is becoming." Anji closed his eyes. "And in sweeping what falls, you learned that nothing stays, and that too is beautiful." That night, Master Anji died. No one wept loudly. They lit incense, chanted softly, and placed his body beneath the oldest bamboo, where the wind always moved in circles. Toma did not leave the monastery. He stayed, and in time, he became the teacher. Children came now, refugees of new wars, heartbreaks, losses unspoken. Toma greeted them not with sermons, but with a broom and a path. He told them no answers, only stories, like the one of the cracked bucket, or the one of the bamboo that bows but does not break. And when one child, a girl with hair like tangled moss, asked, "Why do we sweep a path that's never clean?" Toma smiled. "Because the act of sweeping clears something inside." They swept, and the wind blew gently, carrying the leaves and their stories away. Zen parable reflection. A student once asked a master, "Why do we meditate every day if our thoughts keep returning?" The master replied, Why do you eat every day if you will be hungry again? Philosophical insight. The bamboo path reminds us that impermanence is not a flaw of existence, but its most sacred law. We do not sweep to control nature, but to learn to walk within it. The falling leaves are not our failure. They are our teachers. We must learn to live in rhythm with what returns and what leaves. Psychological reflection. Rituals, like sweeping, are containers for grief, for growth, for grounding. In trauma, the nervous system craves predictability. By honoring the small tasks, like sweeping the path, we give the psyche a rhythm to rest in. Healing, then, is not in the destination, but in the repetition of care. Meditative closing. Close your eyes now. Picture a path covered in golden leaves. You hold a simple broom. With each sweep, let go of one thought. With each breath, let fall one burden. You do not need to finish the path. You only need to begin. Sweep gently. Breathe kindly. You are not here to stay clean. You are here to be present. Story 22. The Fisherman's Horizon. The tide had just turned when Elias pushed his small wooden boat off the shore of Tidewell Bay. The sun was still half asleep, peeking with hesitation over the horizon, casting a silver film over the calm water. Elias had fished these waters for nearly 3 decades, long enough to name the rocks, long enough to read the mood of the ocean just by the way the salt kissed his lips. But this morning felt suspended. The air did not move. Not a single gull broke the silence. Even the waves, usually eager to chatter, seemed to have agreed to a moment of stillness. Elias rowed gently, not with urgency, not with purpose, just movement, breath after breath, stroke after stroke. He wasn't chasing a catch today. Out in the wide blue belly of the bay, he dropped anchor. And then he sat. Not to bait a hook, not to mend a net, just to sit. His oars resting across the boat like sleeping limbs, his hands folded in his lap like a boy awaiting a story. It had been a long winter. Inside his home, a silence had grown between him and his wife Marla. A silence not cold or cruel, but one that hung like mist, making everything damp. They had lost their son 3 years prior. The grief hadn't torn them apart, but it had made them drift, quietly, slowly, like 2 leaves floating in opposite directions. Elias stared at the open water. There were no fish to catch, no answers to find, only the expanse. Suddenly, he heard a voice, soft, brittle, like reeds brushing against the wind. But there was no one. He closed his eyes. And then the memory came. A tale the old lighthouse keeper once told him, back when he was just a boy eager to find wisdom in every weathered face. The Zen parable, the broken paddle. A young fisherman named Daito once paddled deep into a mountain lake known to be haunted by spirits. Villagers warned him, "No one who rows past the 3rd bend returns unchanged." But Daito laughed. "Fear is for those who do not understand the wind." On the 3rd bend, a violent storm came out of nowhere, snapping one of his paddles. His boat spun uncontrollably. Alone, panicked, he shouted to the heavens, "Why do you test me? What have I done?" And then he saw it. In the eye of the storm, standing on the water, was an old monk, robes soaked, eyes calm. The monk didn't speak. He simply gestured to Daito to stop resisting. "But I'm losing control," Daito cried. The monk replied, "There is no control to lose, only the illusion of direction." Exhausted, Daito let the boat drift. The wind died down. The water stilled. And as dawn rose, the current gently carried him home. Daito never repaired the broken paddle. He hung it in his hut to remind him, sometimes surrender is the most courageous stroke. Philosophical commentary. As Elias recalled this old parable, something inside him softened. He had spent so many months rowing, against Marla's silence, against his own sorrow, against the memory of his boy laughing in the reeds, believing that if he paddled hard enough, said the right things, held strong, he could steer their lives back to how they were. But maybe the lesson was simpler. The storm is not always something to fight. Some pain doesn't ask to be fixed. Some losses aren't puzzles. Some hearts, even two broken ones, drift in circles because they are too afraid to just let go. Elias looked down at his hands, calloused and hard. They had built boats, lifted nets, carried his child on his shoulders. But perhaps the bravest thing they could do now was to hold Marla's. Not to save her, not to fix her, but simply to say, I am still here, floating with you. Psychological reflection. Grief has its own current. Often we attempt to manage or suppress it, treat it like a problem to be solved or a wound to be sutured. But grief is not an enemy. It is a tide, a flow that must move through us. In modern psychology, the concept of acceptance is not passive surrender. It is active witnessing. To sit in the boat of our suffering and feel its drift without panic is an act of profound strength. Elias had not failed in his grief, nor had Marla. They had simply clung too long to broken paddles, ideas of what healing should look like, how fast time should move, what normal should return. Only when they allow themselves to drift, individually and together, can the waters begin to calm. Meditative closing. As the sun rose higher, Elias reached for his oars, but then stopped. Instead, he breathed. In. Out. He whispered, not to the sea, not to the gulls, but to himself. There is no control to lose. When he returned to shore, he did not go straight home. He walked slowly, collecting smooth stones. Each one he placed in a line along the path, a breadcrumb trail of presence, of return. That evening, Marla found him in the garden, holding the smallest stone. He didn't speak. She didn't ask. But for the first time in months, their eyes met. And the silence between them no longer felt like absence, but presence. A shared drift, a shared horizon, and the courage, finally, to stop paddling. Meditation prompt. Sit quietly for a few minutes today. Breathe. Visualize a boat in open water. Are you gripping your oars? What happens if you let go? What direction do you fear? What might you find if you simply drift? Quote for reflection. Only when we stop rowing do we notice the direction of the current. Anonymous Zen Master.
Story 23. Narrative opening. High in the hills of a misty coastal village in southern Portugal lived a woman named Mireille. She had once been a symphony cellist in Paris, known for the way her bow could draw tears from even the hardest faces. But now, at 63, she lived in a simple cottage with a chipped teacup, an old cello she hadn't played in a decade, and silence so thick it wrapped around her like an overgrown vine. She did not despise this silence. In fact, she clung to it. Mireille had lost her husband to cancer 6 years ago. Her son no longer spoke to her, estranged by words that had cut too deeply during a grief-laden quarrel. Now, all she had was the silence, the sea, and a mind that refused to rest. Each day she walked along the cliff edge, gazing at the ocean and the cloud-covered horizon. She watched the wind scatter seagulls and waves crash, and she imagined her old life like a book she'd closed before finishing the final chapter. One evening, while sipping weak tea, she noticed a flyer tucked into her gate. Cloud Zen Retreat, 3 days of silence and letting go. The paper smelled of cedar and had been printed with care. She didn't believe in new beginnings, but something in her hands moved before her mind could catch up. She packed the next day.
Zen parable inserted. At the center of the retreat stood a Japanese monk named Daizan, a tall, soft-spoken man whose smile made you feel as though he already forgave you for everything you hadn't said yet. On the second morning, after hours of silent meditation, Daizan stood before the dozen retreat-goers and told a story. There was once a cloud who believed she was the sky. She floated above the valleys, high and mighty, casting shadows on rivers and towns. The cloud took pride in her shape, her movement, and even in her storms. But one day she began to dissipate. The sun grew strong, the wind scattered her, and soon all that remained was vapor. Frightened, she cried out, "Where am I going?" The sky replied, "You were never just a cloud. You are becoming me." Silence followed the story, and then Daizan said quietly, "The ego resists what it already is." Philosophical commentary. In Zen, the self is often mistaken for a fixed identity, our roles, our wounds, our accomplishments, our voice, our silence. But these are like clouds, impermanent, shifting, ever dependent on condition and time. When a person resists change, loss, or aging, they are like the cloud insisting she is only herself, distinct and enduring. But life teaches another lesson. Ego dissolves, bodies age, relationships falter, not as a punishment, but as an invitation to dissolve into something larger, deeper, more integrated. Zen doesn't ask us to destroy the ego. It simply invites us to see it for what it is, a pattern of thoughts that once protected us but now confines us. Like the cloud that feared losing its form, we too tremble at becoming sky. But the sky is not the death of the cloud, it is the cloud's liberation. Psychological reflection. For Mireille, her identity as a wife, a mother, a musician had defined her entire existence. When her husband died and her son left, those roles collapsed, and with them her sense of purpose. Grief filled her like fog, convincing her she was nothing now. But grief, like a stubborn cloud, can obscure the truth without erasing it. Through silent walking meditations and long hours of breath awareness, Mireille began to notice a shift. The first time it happened was subtle. She watched her thoughts without attaching. She heard her own mind say, "You are alone," and for once didn't panic. She simply observed the thought like she would a drifting gull, present, moving, passing. By the final day of the retreat, Daizan said to her during tea, "When you stop trying to be who you were, you allow who you are to arrive." She cried without sobbing. It was not a breakdown, it was a softening. The tears fell like dew, not rain. Meditative closing. Back in her cottage, Mireille took out the cello one morning. The wood felt heavier than she remembered. Dust had settled into the strings. She didn't play. She simply held it. Then she walked to the cliffs again. This time, the wind didn't frighten her. This time, she looked up at the sky and whispered, "I am not the cloud anymore." And she smiled. Meditation prompt. Close your eyes and imagine a cloud in the sky, its edges, its shape, its softness. Watch it float, change, dissolve. Ask yourself, who am I when I stop holding on to my form? Let go of one identity today, just for a moment. Watch what remains. You are not vanishing. You are becoming sky. Story 24. Narrative opening. In the foothills of northern Kyoto, where bamboo forests whisper and crickets sing in long tones at dusk, lived an old woman named Aya. She was known to the villagers as Obasan Aya, the quiet widow with a house that always smelled of dried chrysanthemum and roasted barley. Aya brewed tea each morning in the same clay pot her mother had used, passed down from her grandmother. No one remembered ever seeing her with guests, though the sliding door to her tea room remained open every afternoon, as if waiting. She lived alone, but not because she had no family. Aya had a son, Kaito, who lived in Tokyo. He had not returned in 20 years, not even when Aya's husband died. Not for festivals, not for the New Year, not once. When asked, Aya only replied, "He is busy." But the truth was heavier than the silence she offered. 20 years ago, after a heated argument, Kaito had stormed out of their home, vowing never to return. Aya had called him selfish. He had called her controlling. Words like arrows had flown between them, sharp, final, unforgettable. Over the years, she wrote letters. He never replied. She mailed parcels on his birthday. None were acknowledged. And so the open tea room became her ritual of waiting, a quiet act of hope. One autumn morning, as golden leaves fluttered onto the stone path of her garden, Aya found an envelope tucked beneath the gate. It was addressed in a handwriting she hadn't seen in 2 decades. Her hands trembled. Zen parable inserted. That night, she sat by candlelight and opened an old sutra her mother once loved. Tucked inside was a Zen parable she had nearly forgotten. A man once came to the master carrying a bowl of bitter tea. "I drank from this all my life," he said. "Why does it still taste sharp?" The master replied, "Because each time you sip, you do not see the leaves. You only remember the first wound." The man asked, "How do I change the taste?" The master smiled and said, "Brew again, but this time forgive the tree." Aya read the parable again and again. The words echoed like ripples in her teacup. Forgive the tree. Philosophical commentary. Bitterness is not brewed in a day. Like aged tea leaves left to steep too long, the emotions of blame and resentment darken over time. The Zen view of forgiveness is not forgetting, nor is it about the other person. It is a process of alchemy within the self, transforming the wound into wisdom. To forgive the tree means to acknowledge that all suffering, even betrayal, arises from causes and conditions, often generations deep, shaped by pain we did not create but carry. Forgiveness, then, is the act of brewing again with awareness. It is not weakness, it is spiritual courage. It is not denial, it is release. Psychological reflection. Aya had lived her life with the belief that parents knew best. She had raised Kaito with discipline, tradition, and high expectations. But what she had called structure, he had experienced as control. She never understood his longing for freedom, for modern life in the city. And when he chose art over law school, she had shamed him. "I did everything for you," she had once screamed, tears streaming. And Kaito had replied, "No, you did everything for who you wanted me to be." These words had echoed in Aya's mind for years. When she opened the letter, it was brief. "Mother, I heard you were ill. I don't know if this will mean anything, but I'm sorry for how I left, for how I stayed away. I couldn't be near you without feeling erased. But I also couldn't stop loving you. I don't know if I can return, but I wanted you to know. Kaito." Tears slid down Aya's cheeks, but they didn't sting. They were soft, cleansing, like spring rain after a long drought. She did not know if he would return, but she brewed tea that afternoon anyway. And this time, she used the last of her rare, sweet plum leaves. Narrative continuation. 3 days later, Aya stood by her gate, brushing away fallen leaves, when she saw a figure in the distance. Slim, hesitant, wearing a dark coat and carrying a canvas satchel. She froze.
The man paused at the edge of the stone path. They stared. No words passed between them. Then, slowly, Aya stepped aside and opened the door to the tea room. He followed. She poured hot water into the clay pot, let it steep, and did not rush. When she handed him the cup, he looked at her and said, "You kept the tea room open." She replied, "I kept the tree alive." They drank in silence, but the silence had changed. It was no longer a wall, it was a bridge.
Meditative closing. There are wounds we carry so long they become part of our identity. But the moment we are willing to see beyond the story, beyond who was right or wrong, we open a door for healing. In Zen, a shared cup of tea can be a form of prayer. Forgiveness can be steeped in quiet actions, not grand declarations. And the tea leaves, like our memories, may remain bitter, unless we choose to brew them with love. Contemplative practice. Close your eyes. Picture someone who hurt you or whom you have hurt. Now imagine brewing tea for them. What would it take to invite them into your silence? Could you offer peace even if they never drink? Forgiveness is not about being right. It's about being free.
Story 25. The Gatekeeper's Smile. In the hills of Andalusia, nestled between the wild olive groves and stone terraces, sat a modest stone monastery known simply as La Puerta, the Gate. It was not a grand temple. There were no gilded statues or towering spires. Only one arched doorway opened into a quiet courtyard filled with wind chimes and the scent of lavender. Pilgrims who came here often said they felt as if time slowed when they stepped through that arch, as if something invisible paused, nodded, and allowed them in. The man who greeted them was an old monk named Mateo. He had been the gatekeeper of La Puerta for nearly 60 years. Every morning at dawn, he would sweep the stone path, tend to the small rose bush beside the arch, and then sit on his wooden stool with a cup of warm tea. His back was slightly hunched, his robe always simple, his beard the color of morning ash. But his smile held the weightlessness of a bird in flight. People came to see him from all over the world. Not because he preached or performed miracles, he did neither, but because sitting with Mateo felt like remembering something you didn't know you'd forgotten. One foggy morning, a young neuroscientist named Ayla arrived from Norway. She had been studying consciousness, the self, and neural identity in some of the finest institutions in Europe, yet she found herself weary. Her mind was full, but her soul echoed. She had heard whispers of La Puerta during a conference in Prague. "Go to the gate," an elderly Czech professor had said, laying a wrinkled hand on her shoulder. "The answers aren't always in the brain." So Ayla came, with her laptop, journals, and quiet skepticism. Mateo smiled as she entered. "Welcome," he said. "You've brought heavy luggage, even though your bag is light." Isla blinked. "Excuse me?" He only smiled and motioned toward a small bench beside the courtyard tree. The days passed gently. Mateo never asked her why she came, and Isla never told him. But each morning she joined him as he swept the path. Each afternoon she sat beneath the olive tree and watched the wind dance through its silver-green leaves. Each night she scribbled in her journal, but her entries became less about data and more about wonder. On the 5th day, she finally asked, "Why do people come here? You don't teach, you don't chant or lecture, there's no ritual." Mateo chuckled. "People think they want answers, but they don't. They want to stop needing them." She frowned. "Isn't that giving up?" "No," he said, placing his palm over his heart.
It's stepping through the gate. She looked around. What gate? The one inside you, he said. It only opens when you stop trying to pick the lock. That night, Isla dreamt of herself standing before a vast wooden door. She pulled and pushed, cried and kicked, tried every key she'd collected over the years, books, theories, models, graphs. None fit. In the dream, Matteo stood behind her. "Try nothing," he whispered. She paused, closed her eyes, and in the stillness, the door creaked open, not outward, but inward. The next morning, she sat beside him again, tea in hand. "What's behind the gate, Matteo?" "Nothing," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Nothing?" He nodded. "And everything. It depends on whether you look with eyes or with silence." Zen parable. A student approached the master in the garden and asked, "What is the path to enlightenment?" The master pointed to the gate of the temple. "Walk through." The student stepped forward. "But there is no door." "Exactly," said the master, and returned to watering the flowers. Philosophical reflection. The nature of our seeking is dual intention. We look for gates, doors, secrets, and ultimate truths. But all such mechanisms imply a before and after, a linearity that the awakened mind transcends. True Zen teaches that the gate is not a physical threshold, nor even a metaphysical one. It is a turning inward, an allowing, an ungrasping. In Matteo's monastery, there is no sacred scroll nor hidden chamber. The simplicity is the point. A rosebush, a broom, a bench. These are not distractions from enlightenment, they are its very embodiment. The smile of the gatekeeper is not an answer, it is an invitation. Psychological reflection. From a modern therapeutic lens, the gate symbolizes the transition from cognitive over-identification to a state of mindful presence. Isla's journey mirrors the struggle of many in today's hyper-rational world, an over-reliance on intellect and analysis as the sole path to fulfillment. While these tools are powerful, they often alienate us from the body, the breath, and the present. In mindfulness-based therapeutic, we teach the value of non-striving, the paradox that healing often begins not through effort but through surrender. Matteo's presence is that of the secure base, the psychologically safe figure who allows another to co-regulate and then rediscover internal peace. His smile is the smile of the present moment, non-demanding, non-solving, yet completely sufficient. Tonight, sit in stillness. Imagine an old gate before you, worn, silent, waiting. Breathe. Do not open it. Do not knock. Just be near it. Let the wind brush past. Let the gate forget it was even locked. And if you hear a whisper, like the soft sweep of a broom or the creak of old hinges, smile back. The gate has always been you. The gate is not a place you go. It is the place you stop going. The empty boat. As the ripples of today's story settle in the stillness of your heart, take a moment to reflect. Did something within you shift? Did a forgotten question return? Or perhaps a new silence began to bloom? We created the empty boat to be a gentle companion on your inner journey, a space to breathe, to listen, and to heal through the quiet wisdom of Zen and the deep mirror of modern life. If today's story brought you peace, clarity, or even a pause in the noise of the world, let us know. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your reflections matter. And if you feel this story could resonate with someone close to you, don't hesitate to share it. A single story, passed gently from one heart to another, can change more than we imagine. To continue this journey together, subscribe to The Empty Boat. New stories arrive often, slow, steady, and meant for those who are ready to listen deeply. Until next time, Sit gently in your breath, float quietly in the unknown, and remember, the boat was always empty.